The clay feels cool beneath your fingertips, even through the thin archival gloves. The Ashmolean Museum in Oxford keeps the room temperature steady and exact, the kind of controlled air meant to protect objects that have outlived entire civilizations. In front of you sits a block of baked earth, maybe 2 kilograms, shaped like a 4-sided prism. Every face is packed with wedge-shaped marks, so tiny you almost have to lean in just to believe they are real. This is WB444, the Weld Blundell Prism, and what it holds is the kind of record that makes you pause, not because it is mystical, but because it is so matter-of-fact. It reads like administration, like history, like a list someone expected you to treat as true. The prism was excavated in 1922 from the ruins of ancient Larsa in southern Iraq, though the text itself is much older in content, copied and recopied through generations of scribes. It's one of the most complete versions of what we call the Sumerian king list, a sequence of rulers arranged city by city, dynasty by dynasty, reign by reign. At first it feels familiar. Names you've heard before start to appear. Gilgamesh of Uruk is listed with a reign that, even if exaggerated, still sits in a range your brain can attempt to interpret. Symbolic, legendary, maybe stretched by oral tradition, but not completely unthinkable. Then the list reaches a line that changes everything. It divides time with a blunt statement, then the flood swept over. And on the other side of that line, history behaves differently. Before the flood, the rains explode into impossible lengths. 8 kings, 5 cities, a total that climbs into the thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. Alalngar follows with 36,000. The numbers keep going in the same tone, without apology, without explanation, like the scribe expects you to nod and keep reading. That is what makes the prism so unsettling. These are not myths written like myths. The text does not wink at you. It does not frame itself as a poetic tale. It presents these reigns as records, as the official backbone of kingship, as the timeline that makes later legitimacy possible. And it gets more complicated, because the Sumerians treated lists like this seriously. They preserved them. They copied them. They built political legitimacy on them. They kept these numbers alive across centuries, which means the gap isn't a modern invention. The gap is baked into the Sumerian memory of their own past. So what do we do with that? This is not a video about proving ancient astronauts or trying to force a conspiracy into every crack in the evidence. That is not what we are doing here. What we are doing is simpler and honestly harder. We are looking at what the tablets actually claim, how the Sumerians frame their own origins, and why the patterns they preserved still create questions modern history struggles to close neatly. Because if you take their texts seriously as cultural memory, the Sumerians don't describe themselves as the beginning of civilization. They describe themselves as something closer to a return, a restoration, a rebuilding after catastrophe. And that single idea changes how you look at everything else. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, temples, law codes, not as inventions that slowly emerge from trial and error, but as systems that appear already functional, already confident, already established. So if you're listening from somewhere quiet, somewhere you can sink into this with me, leave a comment with where you are and what time it is. It helps me see where these stories land, and it's kind of fitting for a video about time memory and what survives. Because the prism does not just list kings, it implies a structure to reality. Kingship descends, then a flood wipes the slate, then kingship descends again. The question is, what else descends with it? Now let's step away from the museum case for a moment and walk out into the landscape the Sumerians actually lived in. When archaeologists first excavated the great mound of Uruk in southern Iraq, the city that gives its name to an entire period of Mesopotamian history, they found something that made the timeline feel strangely abrupt. Uruk appears around 4000 BCE, and it does not arrive like a slow-growing village that gradually becomes a town, then becomes a city. It shows up as a true urban centre sprawling across more than 6 square kilometres, with monumental buildings, massive temple complexes, administrative centres, and a standardised system for tracking goods and labour. And then there's the detail that always gets people: writing. Not playful scratch marks, not simple doodles, not a clumsy first attempt that takes centuries to mature. Thousands of clay tablets appear in the archaeological layers, and the system is already capable of recording inventories, rations, property transfers, labour assignments, and more abstract concepts that require more than simple pictures. If you expect a long learning curve, you start looking for rough drafts, earlier stages, experiments, transitional forms where the system is clearly still being invented. But the Uruk period often feels like you arrived after the invention already happened. Conventional scholarship explains this by pointing to the Ubaid period, the long stretch before Uruk, roughly 5900 to 4000 BCE, when villages across southern Mesopotamia developed agriculture, pottery traditions, and irrigation practices. And yes, the Ubaid foundation matters. It shows continuity. It shows people learning to manage water, settle, land store surplus, organise communities. But here's the tension. The transition from Ubaid villages to Uruk cities looks less like gradual growth and more like a sudden change in scale and complexity. Almost overnight, archaeologically speaking, you see multiple systems appear together. Proto-writing that quickly becomes a tool for bureaucracy, complex irrigation networks that require centralised planning, monumental architecture built to standardised measurements, cylinder seals used to mark property and authority, a base 60 mathematical system we still use today for time and angles, standardised weights and measures that support large-scale trade, specialised metalwork that requires controlled temperatures and technique. Each of these developments on its own should take time, generations of practice, iteration, failure and adjustment, a visible trail of learning. But in Uruk, they show up like a toolkit already laid out on the table. And once you notice that pattern, you start seeing it elsewhere too. Temples, for example. If there is one place where the idea of memory architecture becomes almost literal, it's Eridu, the city, the Sumerians themselves described as the first settlement in the world. Excavations in the mid-20th century uncovered something remarkable there, a sequence of temples built one on top of another, layer after layer spanning thousands of years. The earliest temple in the sequence is small, almost humble, but what matters is not its size. What matters is that it establishes a template, a sacred orientation, an internal axis, a relationship between entrance altar and offering space. And then for centuries, generations rebuild on that exact spot, maintaining that same orientation, keeping that same central alignment, expanding the structure but refusing to abandon the original plan. It's like the site is remembering itself. And if that is true, then you have to ask a strange question. What kind of knowledge does a Neolithic community need to place a marker in the ground and somehow set principles that later urban civilizations will still follow 2,000 years later? How do you build a temple that doesn't feel like an experiment, but like the first page of a design manual that will be used for millennia? The Sumerians had an answer for that. They said the knowledge wasn't invented, it was given, it descended. And whether you take that literally or culturally, it points to the same uncomfortable centre the Sumerians preserved, a story where civilization is not born once, but delivered, interrupted, and delivered again. And the prism in Oxford, sitting quietly behind glass, keeps repeating the same hinge in the timeline. Then the flood swept over. Then kingship descended again. The next thing you notice, once you start paying attention to how the Sumerians framed their past, is that the flood is not treated like a random disaster. It is treated like a boundary stone, a hard cut in the record, a dividing line where one kind of time ends and another kind begins. And that is why the Sumerian king list is so important. It is not the only copy. It is not even the only style. There are multiple versions, broken fragments, scattered across museum collections, each with small variations, the kind you would expect from scribes copying a text across centuries. Names shift slightly, a number changes here or there, a city order moves, but the backbone stays the same. History is split at the flood. And before the flood, the rains are not just long, they are in a category of long that does not fit the normal way humans keep time. The list opens with a sentence that sounds confident, almost official. Kingship descends from heaven, not rises, not grows, not develops slowly out of social needs. It descends. It arrives as an established thing. Then it tells you exactly where it lands first. Eridu. And then it begins counting. Alulim becomes king. He rules for 28,800 years. Alangar follows with 36,000. The numbers continue city by city. Bad Tabira, Larak, Sipar, Shuruppak. Each city receives kingship. Each king rules for spans that stretch beyond anything a normal human lifespan can contain. And the text does not soften it. There is no poetic language, no signal that you are supposed to interpret these numbers as metaphor. It reads like a ledger. Then the flood sweeps over. And after that line, kingship descends again, this time to Kish, and the rains begin to shrink. They're still long at first, but they move in a direction you recognize. Hundreds of years, then numbers that start to settle closer to what feels like historical time. Eventually, you arrive at rulers like Gilgamesh, still larger than life, but now in a range where you can imagine a real person behind the legend. That pattern matters because it looks intentional. Not random exaggeration, but a structured tapering. One mode of time, then a reset, then a gradual normalization. If you are trying to understand how a culture thinks about its own beginnings, that is not a trivial detail. That is the culture telling you in its own paperwork tone that something happened that changed the rules of time itself. So what do scholars normally do with this? The common approach is to treat the early kings as legendary figures part of a mythic age, and to treat the flood as a cultural memory of major regional flooding. That is a reasonable explanation. Mesopotamia is a land of rivers that can turn from life-givers into destroyers. If you live on a flat alluvial plain, a major flood can wipe out settlements, destroy crops, and scatter people. A flood large enough can feel world-ending, but there is still a problem you can't just sweep away. The Sumerians were not careless with numbers. Their administrative tablets show intense realism. They count sheep jars of barley tools' labour days. They track debts. They calculate land. They measure canals. They use mathematics to solve practical problems. So why would this same scribal culture that can list 14 jars of barley and mean exactly 14 jars of barley suddenly lose all sense of scale when it comes to the foundation record of kingship? That is the tension. Either the numbers are symbolic, but then you have to ask why those specific numbers repeated so consistently. Or the numbers are based on a system of time we do not fully understand, and then you have to ask what system that would be. Or the numbers reflect a chronological inheritance the scribes preserved, even if it made no immediate sense. That last option is the one that keeps tugging at the edge of the conversation because it fits the tone of the text. The king list reads like something copied from older authority, like scribes are preserving what they believe to be their official past, even if it contains an uncomfortable gap. And you see this same structure echoed in another text that adds important context. There is a Sumerian flood story often called the Eridu Genesis. It is damaged incomplete, but enough survives to reveal the framework. Humanity exists. Cities are established. Kingship is operating. Then the gods decide to send a flood. A man is warned. He builds a boat. Life survives. The waters retreat. Civilization resumes. That is the same sequence as the king list. Cities before the flood. Flood as the dividing event. Restoration after. And the language is not framed like a distant fairy tale. It reads like a remembered sequence, like something that happened in these places to these people in the world that eventually became their world. Now, whether you believe any of it as literal history is a separate question, but culturally, the Sumerians are making a claim about themselves. We are not the first. We are the ones who continued. That leads into an idea that changes how you look at the sudden appearance of complex systems in Mesopotamia, because if your model of civilization is steady progress, you expect a gradual climb. Villages become towns, towns become cities, administration grows, writing emerges, math becomes more sophisticated, knowledge accumulates. But the Sumerian texts suggest a different storyline. Knowledge exists, catastrophe interrupts, knowledge is preserved, civilization returns. Not invention, but restoration. And once you start looking at their literature through that lens, you begin to notice how often the texts emphasize transmission. Not just survival of people, but survival of skills. Not just saving animals and seeds, but saving the crafts. There's an ancient story known as Atrahasis, preserved in later copies, but rooted in older tradition. In this version, the wise man is warned about the flood and told to build a boat. That part is familiar, but the emphasis is not only on escaping. The emphasis is also on carrying forward the foundation of organised life. You are not just saving bodies, you are saving know-how, craftsmen, tools, seeds, the practical structure of rebuilding. Again, whether you take this literally or not, the theme stays consistent. Knowledge is something you can lose, so you must carry it across the gap. And then there is a smaller, quieter text that makes this idea feel almost personal. The Instructions of Shurupak. It is a wisdom text framed as a father speaking to his son. The advice is grounded in everyday reality. Don't take responsibility for someone else's debt. Don't make legal decisions when you've been drinking beer. Don't buy a donkey that brays too much. It will make your life miserable. These lines are practical, even funny in places. The kind of advice someone gives after watching people make the same mistakes for years. But the frame is what matters. The father is Shurupak, linked to the city of Shurupak, and the son is Ziusudra, the flood survivor in Sumerian tradition. So the text is positioned like this. Here is wisdom from the world before the flood, handed to the one person who will carry it through. Even if you treat that as literary framing, it shows you what the scribes wanted their students to feel. This is not just wise advice. This is a bridge across time. This is knowledge that crosses the boundary, and that gives us another way to think about the archaeological pattern that bothers so many researchers. When writing appears in Mesopotamia, it does not look like a primitive toy. It looks like a tool used by an administration that already knows what it wants from the tool. When mathematics appears, it does not look like random counting. It looks standardized. When astronomy appears, it looks systematic. When temple architecture grows, it grows along established rules. It is as if the first written evidence we have is not the first moment the knowledge existed, but the first moment the knowledge is being recorded in the surviving medium we can still touch. That is the crucial point. Clay lasts. Wood, leather, reeds, woven materials do not. So there is a real possibility that earlier stages of knowledge existed and simply did not survive. But even that explanation still leaves the same question hanging in the air. Why does it all appear together, already working, already coordinated, already interlocked? Because writing math astronomy standardized measures administrative systems and temple institutions are not isolated inventions. They reinforce each other. They lock together. They create a complete package. And the Sumerian memory expressed again and again is that civilization is exactly that, a package of powers, a set of principles that can be held, transferred, and applied. That brings us to a word that shows up in their worldview with unusual weight, the me. These are often described as the divine principles of civilization. But the concept is broader than a single translation can capture. The me include the arts, the crafts, the institutions, the social rules, the tools of order, everything from kingship to writing to music to metalwork to law. The Sumerian idea is not that humans slowly discover each of these. The idea is that they are granted, distributed, placed into the world. So when kingship descends, it is not just a political office falling from the sky in a symbolic sense. It is the arrival of a whole civilizational structure that makes kingship possible. And that is why the flood matters so much, because the flood is the moment where that structure is threatened, interrupted, almost lost. But the texts refuse to treat it as total loss. They treat it as a break followed by a return. The flood sweeps over, then kingship descends again. And if kingship descends again, the unspoken question is, what else comes down with it? What else is restored? What else is remembered? Because when Uruk rises into the archaeological record as a full city, when its administrative tablets show a writing system already doing its job, when its temples are already measuring space with confidence, when its society is already running on coordinated systems, it fits cleanly into the Sumerian model of restoration. Not because it proves the model, but because the pattern aligns with what their memory insists. Knowledge is not something they claim to have invented in isolation. Knowledge is something they claim to have received, preserved, and put back into motion after the waters went down. If you keep following that thread, the one about knowledge being carried across a break in history, you eventually run into a different kind of evidence. Not a king list, not a flood story, something quieter, almost stubbornly practical. Numbers. Clay tablets covered in numbers arranged in neat columns. The kind of thing that does not care about myth or symbolism. The kind of thing that was used for real decisions, real building projects, real land division, real planning. One of the most famous is a tablet often called Plimpton 322. It is small broken on one edge with 4 columns of numbers written in cuneiform. When scholars first began to understand what it contained, it stopped being just an old artifact and turned into a question with sharp teeth. Because the numbers form a table of relationships within right triangles, not in the loose sense of someone noticing that triangles can be measured, in the exact sense of listing whole number sets that satisfy the relationship between the sides of a right triangle, what modern math calls Pythagorean triples. And the tablet does not explain what it is doing. It does not teach you the concept. It does not walk you through a discovery. It simply uses the relationship as if it is ordinary, as if it is part of a standard toolkit. That is the startling thing about Mesopotamian mathematics when you look at it closely. It is not primitive. It is not a culture taking baby steps into arithmetic. It is efficient and methodical, and it shows up in a form that suggests a system already established. There are other tablets too, problem tablets that solve what we would call quadratic relationships. Tablets calculating field areas that are not perfect squares. Tablets dividing inheritances in fair proportions. Tablets using place value. Tablets with multiplication tables so consistent they feel like school posters. And you start to feel the shape of something. This was not casual number play. This was an organised mathematical tradition used for surveying architecture, accounting and education, which raises the question that keeps coming back in different costumes. Where is the slow build? Where are the messy drafts? Where are the tablets that show the first uncertain steps? The early mistakes that lead to later refinement? The period where one city uses one method, another city uses a different method, and eventually the best approach wins. Instead, what you often see is mathematics functioning like a mature language. It is already standardized enough to teach, already stable enough to rely on. And the base system they chose makes this even stranger. The Sumerians counted in base 60, a sexagesimal system. At first that sounds like a random ancient quirk, but then you see why it matters. 60 divides cleanly by a long list of numbers. That makes fractions easy: halves, thirds, quarters, fifths, sixths. You can split things without getting stuck in ugly fractions that never terminate. It is a brilliant system for a civilization that needs to divide land, distribute rations, calculate labour, and manage trade. And we still live with it. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. That is not modern invention. That is inheritance. The system works so well it survived every cultural turnover that came after it. But here is the awkward part. Base 10 is intuitive. 10 fingers. Easy. Base 20 also intuitive. Fingers and toes. Base 5 one hand. Base 60 is not intuitive. It is chosen because of its properties, because it behaves beautifully in division. That is the kind of choice you make after you already understand how important division is. Which means the earliest evidence of Sumerian numerical work does not show a culture feeling its way toward sophisticated math. It shows a culture already using a system optimized for complex calculation. Now, someone might argue that the optimization happened gradually during a period we cannot see. Maybe people spent generations using different counting methods, and base 60 slowly became dominant. Maybe earlier evidence exists but has not survived. That is possible. But the fact remains that the earliest written mathematical tradition we can actually hold in our hands is already operating with sexagesimal logic. And that pattern repeats again when you look at measurement: length, area, volume, weight. The Mesopotamian world had standardized units that allowed different cities to trade and tax and build using the same reference points. Surveyors could measure land consistently. Merchants could weigh goods in a way others recognized. Standardization is not easy. It requires agreement. It requires authority. It requires enforcement. It requires training. And it tends to evolve from messier local systems. Yet in early city-state administration, you see these units used as if they have always been there, as if the system is already shared. How did that happen so early? How did multiple city-states in a fragmented region align on a measurement culture strong enough to run bureaucracy? And then you realise something else. The scribal schools, the Aduba, were not just teaching writing, they were teaching a whole knowledge system, and mathematics was one of its core pillars. Student tablets survived that show, scribes practicing, copying multiplication tables, working through standard procedures, solving structured problems, sometimes making mistakes, sometimes being corrected. So you do see learning, you do see training, but you do not see invention. Students are not discovering the system. They are being trained in a system that already exists. That is a huge difference. And it aligns perfectly with the way the Sumerians talked about knowledge in general. They did not frame mathematics as something humans created through genius or experimentation. They framed it as part of the package of civilizational powers. Something received, something handed down, something preserved. Later traditions talk about sages from a time beyond ordinary memory teachers who brought the arts of civilization. Again, you do not have to take those figures literally to see the underlying worldview. The worldview is about transmission. Knowledge exists. A society receives it. The society maintains it through teaching. The society uses it. The society preserves it through copying. So when you look at Plimpton 322 and you see a trigonometric style table that is already practical and already precise, the tablet feels less like the beginning of something and more like a snapshot taken midstream. You are not watching math being born, you are watching math being used. And that brings up another important detail about Mesopotamian mathematics. It does not look like the Greek tradition. Greek math, at least, in the way it is often remembered, is tied to named thinkers and visible argument, proof, geometry drawn out with logic, schools that debate, methods that evolve over time and leave behind philosophical footprints. Mesopotamian math looks like applied engineering intelligence. It is practical. It is procedural. It produces answers. It is organized for training. And that difference matters because it suggests that the math is embedded inside an administrative and technical culture rather than a philosophical one. It is not trying to impress you with proof. It is trying to help you build and measure and plan. Which means the knowledge could be old without leaving behind the kind of narrative Greece leaves behind. Still, the question remains. How did it become so complete so early? Because even applied mathematics has a development curve. Someone has to notice patterns. Someone has to test methods. Someone has to standardize procedures. Someone has to decide which tables are worth copying and which are not. Someone has to design training sequences that take students from basic multiplication up to complex problem solving. That is institutional knowledge. And when you see institutional knowledge already functioning, you have to ask what came first. Did the institutions build the knowledge, or did inherited knowledge demand the institutions? This question becomes even sharper when you realize that mathematics in Mesopotamia is not isolated. It is tied directly into other systems. You need math for surveying because canals must be built and maintained. You need math for building because temple platforms and walls require planning. You need math for bureaucracy because rations and labour must be tracked. You need math for astronomy because calendars depend on cycles. So if math appears complete, it supports the idea that a full system is already being deployed. And now the flood boundary in the king list starts to feel less like a mythic decoration and more like a conceptual explanation for why a complete toolkit appears in the record. A break, a disruption, a period where transmission is threatened, then restoration, then a return of systems that are already developed, not invented on the spot, but put back into practice. Again, you do not have to accept the Sumerian explanation as literal history to see why it appealed to them. If you live in a land where a river can wipe out a city, where a flood can flatten homes and scatter families, the fear is not only death. The fear is forgetting, losing what you know, losing how to build, losing how to measure, losing how to organize. And if you rebuild, and you still have the old rules, still have the old measurements, still have the old procedures, you would feel as if something survived. Something crossed the gap. Something was preserved. And the tablets sitting there with calm precision suggest exactly that. A mathematics that functions. A system that teaches. A structure that survives. Plimpton 322 does not tell you who invented its logic. It does not tell you when the first table was made. It does not show you the first person who realised the relationship between sides of triangles could be organised and reused. It simply sits in silence and says, here are the numbers, and they work. And in that silence, you feel the same kind of gap you felt in the king list. Not a gap in the numbers themselves, a gap in origin, a gap between the moment knowledge must have been formed and the moment we first see it written down. A gap that Mesopotamian tradition fills with transmission, a gap that modern explanation fills with missing evidence. Either way, the tablet remains. The math remains. The system remains. And the deeper you go, the more it feels like you're not watching a civilization inventing from scratch, but a civilization running on knowledge it already trusts, already knows how to teach, already knows how to preserve. Which leads to the next place where the same pattern appears, not in numbers on clay, but in the sky itself, tracked night after night by people who watch with such patience that their records can still make modern minds pause. At night in southern Mesopotamia, the sky can feel enormous. The land is flat. The horizon is wide. There are no mountains to break the view, no thick forests to swallow the stars. You can stand on a rise of packed earth and watch the heavens move like a slow machine. Now imagine doing that not once for wonder, but every night for years. Noticing patterns is easy. Maintaining a program of observation is something else. It requires discipline, continuity, and a reason strong enough to keep people watching even when nothing exciting happens. That is what makes Mesopotamian astronomy so interesting. It is not the romance of stargazing, it is the structure. One of the best known examples is a group of tablets commonly called the MUL.APN compendium. It is basically a reference manual, a star catalogue, a set of rules and lists designed to be used, copied, consulted. These tablets organise constellations by their heliacal risings, those first mornings when a star becomes visible just before sunrise after being hidden. They track the length of days and nights through the year. They connect sky events to calendars, festivals and agricultural timing. And what stands out immediately is this. The text assumes the reader already knows what to do with the sky. It does not sound like a culture figuring out which stars matter. It sounds like a culture preserving a system that already decided that. The constellations are divided into three paths. Northern, equatorial, southern. Not in poetic terms, but in practical categories used for tracking the movement of the year. It lists stars and groups, giving rising dates relationships between them, and sometimes notes that link them to seasons. This is organised knowledge, not casual observation. To build something like that, you need more than a curious mind. You need accumulated records. You need repeated checking. You need correction. You need consistency in how you name things and measure time. And then you hit another layer of precision when you look at the Venus observations. There are tablets that record Venus as morning star and evening star, showing when it appears, when it disappears, how long it stays visible, and how those cycles repeat. The key point is not the mythology around Venus. The key point is that someone watched every morning, every evening, over and over, writing down not just that Venus was there, but exactly when it showed up in the calendar, how long it stayed, and when it vanished again. That kind of record is not a hobby. It is institutional work. Someone had to support the observers. Someone had to keep the calendar stable enough to date observations. Someone had to preserve the tablets so later scribes could compare present cycles to older ones. And the motivation for all this in Mesopotamia was often divination. The sky was seen as a language, an omen system, a way the gods signalled what might happen on Earth. But here is something people overlook. Divination only works if you know the normal pattern. You cannot call something a sign unless you understand what usually happens. So ironically, the more a culture depends on omens, the more it must become scientifically disciplined in observation. You have to know what is ordinary before you can identify what is unusual. That means astronomy becomes data, not just stories, data stored in clay. And over time, this data becomes predictive. Eclipses are a perfect example. To predict an eclipse with real confidence, you need long records. You need patterns spanning decades and centuries. You need to notice cycles that repeat and track them against calendars. You cannot do that with a single lifetime of observation. You need generations. You need continuity. And Mesopotamian astronomy shows signs of exactly that kind of long continuity. Not because the texts brag about being scientific, but because the level of accuracy implies deep record keeping. So the question becomes, how did they keep the chain unbroken? This region was not peaceful. Cities fought each other. Dynasties rose and collapsed. Empires formed and fractured. Floods and droughts hit. Temples were rebuilt. Libraries burned or were buried. Yet the knowledge survives in an unbroken enough way that later scribes can preserve systems that still make sense. That persistence is not automatic. It has to be maintained. The built environment helped. Ziggurats, those enormous stepped platforms rising above the plain, are not just dramatic religious monuments, they are also stable elevated observation points. A place with clear sight lines, a place above dust and low haze, a place where the horizon is visible for heliacal risings. The social structure helped too. Priestly classes and temple administrators were not subsistence farmers. They were people supported by the economy, which means they could dedicate time to record keeping. And the writing system itself was the engine that allowed memory to become durable. Clay is heavy. Clay is slow. Clay is inconvenient. But clay is stubborn. When it dries and bakes, it lasts. That is why this matters for the larger question about origins. Because when you see astronomy functioning as a reference system, you are not just seeing curiosity, you are seeing infrastructure, observation platform, calendar system, record keeping, teaching tradition, copying tradition. And this infrastructure appears in a period when other complex systems appear too like writing and advanced mathematics. That clustering is the thing that keeps nagging. If this were a slow build, you might expect the pieces to emerge separately. Basic observation first, then a better calendar, then record keeping, then a catalogue, then prediction. But the earliest phases we can see already show a knowledge system organised enough to train people and preserve tables. So once again, you face the same style of gap. Not a gap of existence, a gap of development. Because you can imagine how astronomy develops in theory. People notice the moon changes, they notice the sun sets in different places through the year. They notice stars rise and set. They start naming patterns. They track seasons. They link it to planting. That is the human part. But to get from that to predictive models and standardized catalogues, you need long continuity. You need careful measurement. You need stable institutions that do not let the knowledge slip. So when you see the end result, you have to ask whether the invisible part is simply lost to time, or whether the tradition had roots deeper than the record we currently have. And this is where the Mesopotamian texts offer their own framing. They often refer to ancient experts, old scholars, wisdom from earlier times. They treat their astronomical tradition as inherited, not as a brand new achievement. That matters because it shows a cultural attitude. They were not proud of novelty. They were proud of accuracy and continuity. A scribe copying a star catalogue was not trying to be original. He was trying to be correct. And correctness implies an authoritative standard that already existed. Another detail worth noticing: astronomical knowledge is only useful if it connects to life. You can track stars forever, but if it does not help you decide when to plant, when to harvest, when to hold festivals, when to collect taxes, it becomes a luxury. In Mesopotamia, the sky was a clock. Festivals had to happen on the right days. Temples needed to coordinate rituals across cities. Kings wanted favourable omens. Farmers wanted reliable seasonal cues. So the sky became a shared schedule, and that creates political pressure to standardise. If a city is using a calendar, it needs consistency. If a king is coordinating religious legitimacy, he needs the calendar to be recognised. If trade networks link multiple regions, they need timekeeping that does not drift wildly. So astronomy becomes tied to governance, which means the survival of astronomy across political change also makes sense. New kings still need legitimacy. Temples still need festivals. Agriculture still needs seasons. So the observational tradition continues because it is deeply embedded in civilization itself. Still, the origin question does not go away. You can see why the system survived, but you still wonder how it started so fully formed. How the earliest known written tradition already shows categories and lists that feel like they come from a long background of observation. How it already assumes training. How it already assumes stable naming systems and calendar dating. That is why, when the Sumerian king list talks about kingship descending and other texts talk about wisdom being given, it is not just mythology in the abstract. It is a way to explain why knowledge feels older than the record. If you inherit a system that works, you do not waste time reinventing it. You preserve it. You treat it as authoritative. You teach it. And if you believe it came from a sacred source, you protect it even more fiercely. The night sky in that sense becomes another kind of archive. It repeats patterns over and over. The stars rise when they rise. Venus cycles when it cycles. The moon keeps its rhythm. The sky does not forget. The people watching it, though, can forget if the chain breaks. So the real miracle is not the sky. The real miracle is continuity. A culture maintaining enough institutional strength to keep records across generations long enough to turn observation into prediction. And once you see that, you start looking for the places where continuity is most clearly visible, not in the sky itself, but on the ground, in the way sacred architecture can hold a template so tightly that it seems to carry memory in brick and mud. Because there is a place where you can literally walk through layers of rebuilding and watch a civilization keep the same alignment across thousands of years, as if the blueprint itself is being guarded. And that place is the Temple Mound at Eridu. Eridu sits in a landscape that looks empty until you understand what you are looking at. A low mound, broken brick, wind pushing fine dust through cracks. It does not look like the centre of anything anymore. But beneath that sand, beneath those layers of collapsed walls and abandoned floors, there is a kind of stubborn continuity that is almost unsettling. Because the story of Eridu is not the story of a single temple. It is the story of the same temple being rebuilt again and again, each time larger, each time more elaborate, yet locked into a template that does not shift. Archaeologists uncovered a sequence of sacred structures stacked like pages in a book, one built directly on top of the last. 18 in total, spanning thousands of years, and the lowest one, the earliest, is small, a simple room, mud brick, a niche in the wall, an offering platform. But the important detail is orientation. The entrance lines up along an axis. The niche sits in a specific relationship to that entrance. The offering platform sits where it sits for a reason. Then the next temple comes, and it preserves the same axis. Then the next, same axis, again and again through centuries, that saw villages grow into towns, towns swell into cities, dynasties rise and fall, languages shift, political borders shift, even as the sacred plan remains. If you are used to thinking of early architecture as trial and error, this is strange. You expect experimentation. You expect variation. You expect some structures to fail and be replaced by improved designs. You expect the earliest to be crude and the later to be sophisticated, and yes, the later ones are larger and more complex. But the core plan does not evolve in the way you expect. It expands like a seed growing into a tree, but the seed already contains the pattern. So the question becomes simple, and it has weight. How did the earliest builders know what to keep? How did a community living in a world we label Neolithic establish a sacred geometry that later urban civilizations would treat as fixed? Why did they keep the exact same orientation? Why did the altar niche remain in that relationship to the entrance? Why did the offering space remain anchored on the same axis? You can say tradition, you can say ritual memory, you can say a priestly class passed it down. Those answers might be true, but then you still have to answer what the tradition was based on, because a tradition that lasts 3,000 years is not a casual habit. It is a deliberate act of preservation. And the more you look at Mesopotamian temple building, the more you see language that matches what the bricks show. In royal inscriptions and literary compositions, rulers often do not claim they designed temples. They claim they received the design, not as a vague blessing, as a plan. Measurements, materials, orientation. The temple is treated like something that exists as an ideal form, already perfected, and the human role is execution. A ruler dreams, a god appears. The god shows the layout. Another divine figure interprets the dream and explains what must be done. You can read this as religious propaganda, a king claiming divine approval to justify his power. That happens in many cultures, but even if you frame it that way, you still have to notice what kind of propaganda it is. It is not a king boasting about creativity. It is a king boasting about obedience to a blueprint. That is an unusual thing to emphasize unless your culture believes the blueprint itself matters. And if the blueprint matters, it implies that the knowledge of how to create sacred space is not a personal talent. It is a system that includes astronomy, because orientation is not random. A system that includes mathematics because proportion and measurement are not casual. A system that includes engineering because massive mud brick platforms must stand without collapsing. A system that includes ritual because consecration is treated as part of construction, not an afterthought. When all of this is held together, you begin to see temple building not as simple architecture, but as applied cosmology. The temple is not just a building, it is an interface, a place where the pattern of the heavens is mirrored on earth, a place where order is maintained, a place where divine presence is made stable. That is why ziggurats matter too. A ziggurat is an engineering problem disguised as a religious monument. Mud brick is not stone. It is heavy, it erodes, it absorbs water, it cracks. Building a high platform out of it requires calculated solutions. Drainage channels to prevent water buildup, bitumen waterproofing, reed matting layers for tensile strength, a careful balance of mass and slope so the structure does not shift. And again, the striking thing is competence. The earliest ziggurats we know are not wobbly experiments. They are stable enough to endure centuries. Later ones become larger and more elaborate, but the basic engineering approach already works. Which brings you back to the same pattern seen in the mathematics and the star catalogues. A system being applied, not a system being invented in public. And Eridu, with its stacked temples, becomes the most physical proof of that preservation impulse. Because you can imagine a city rebuilding its temple in the same spot out of nostalgia. You can imagine a community choosing a sacred location and refusing to abandon it. That makes sense. But the precision of alignment over millennia suggests something more than emotional attachment. It suggests that builders believed the geometry itself carried meaning, that changing it would break something, that the temple must remain aligned in the correct way because the alignment is part of what makes it sacred. This is where the Sumerian language about kingship and knowledge feels less abstract. They often describe kingship as something that descends, something that comes down, something established from above. They describe the civilizing powers as a set of principles possessed and transferred. They describe wisdom as something housed in a deep freshwater abyss, guarded and distributed. They do not describe civilization as a messy human invention that evolves by accident. They describe it as a structure with a pattern implemented on Earth. And temples are the perfect place to watch that worldview become brick. Because even when kings change, the temple plan remains. Even when political power shifts, the sacred axis remains. Even when cities fall and are rebuilt, the orientation remains. Eridu becomes a memory machine, not a museum artifact, a living tradition maintained through rebuilding. And once you see that it reframes something else that often gets treated like a separate topic, the scribal schools, because if you want a blueprint to survive 3,000 years, you need more than oral tradition, you need training, you need a class of people whose job is to remember correctly. And Mesopotamia had that. Young scribes trained not to be innovative, but to be accurate. Copying old texts, copying lists, copying hymns, copying measurements, copying procedures. The educational culture reinforces the architectural culture. Both are about transmission. The temple teaches the next generation where the axis must remain. The school teaches the next generation how to record and maintain the system. And then you notice something else. Temple construction narratives often emphasize finding old foundations. A ruler restores a temple by digging down locating the ancient base and rebuilding on that. The idea is not to modernize. The idea is to return to the proper form, to restore what was originally established. That word restore becomes loaded, because restoration assumes there is an earlier, correct version. A version worth returning to. A version that belongs to a time seen as authoritative. So when you see Eridu rebuilt again and again, with the same alignment, you are not just watching a building tradition, you are watching a cultural mind at work. A culture that believes the best knowledge is ancient. A culture that believes sacred order must be preserved, not reinvented. A culture that treats continuity as a virtue. And in that context, the flood boundary in their historical texts stops being just a story element. It becomes an explanation for why continuity is so precious. If catastrophe can erase cities, then the goal is to keep the pattern alive long enough for rebuilding. Keep the plan, keep the measures, keep the rituals, keep the knowledge. Then when conditions allow you scale up again, that is exactly what Eridu looks like in archaeological layers. Not a sudden invention of temples, but a persistent sacred template that grows. A template that begins small and stays aligned. Which is hard to reconcile with the idea that early Mesopotamian religion was purely experimental. It was not experimenting with what a temple is. It was expanding what a temple could become. So Eridu becomes a pivot point in a different way. Not because it proves anything mystical, but because it gives you a tangible example of the same phenomenon you keep seeing in clay texts. A complete idea present at the beginning. A pattern preserved through time. A system maintained through training and rebuilding. If you want to understand why Mesopotamian civilization repeatedly describes itself as receiving knowledge rather than inventing it, Eridu helps. It is not just words on a tablet. It is the ground itself repeating the same alignment for thousands of years. And now once you accept that a culture can preserve a template with that level of discipline, you have to confront another set of texts that talk about preservation in a more direct way. Not architecture, not math, not star lists, but practical human wisdom attributed to a world on the far side of a catastrophe, written as advice from a father to a son who is meant to carry it through. A text that reads like everyday life, yet is framed as knowledge from a time beyond memory. The Instructions of Shurupak. The Instructions of Shurupak does not feel like a myth when you first hear it. It feels like someone sitting across from you, leaning in, giving you the kind of advice that comes from living long enough to watch mistakes repeat. It talks about donkeys, about beer, about lending money, about how people behave when you trust them too quickly, about how reputation can take years to build and a single foolish decision to ruin. And that is the strange thing. If the text were trying to sound like divine revelation, you would expect thunder. You would expect cosmic language. You would expect monsters and battles and mysteries. Instead, you get blunt practicality. Do not vouch for someone because they will hold you to it. Do not make judgments when you are drinking because your mouth will outrun your mind. Do not buy a loud braying donkey because it will make your life miserable. This is ordinary life, which means the society behind it is not primitive in the way people imagine early history. It assumes property. It assumes contracts. It assumes loans and guarantees and social pressure. It assumes a legal environment where words matter and obligations follow you. The advice only makes sense inside a structured civilization, and yet the framing of this wisdom is not casual. The text is attributed to Shurupak, a figure tied to a city listed as the last one before the flood in the Sumerian king list tradition. and the son receiving the advice is Yusudra, the same name associated in other texts with surviving the Great Deluge. So the instructions present themselves as wisdom delivered at a boundary, a father teaching a son who will carry knowledge through catastrophe. The father is not teaching him how to invent civilization, he is teaching him how to live inside one without being destroyed by human weakness. Because civilization is not only cities and temples, it is people, it is greed, it is pride, it is impulsiveness, it is betrayal, it is foolishness. It is the daily choices that either hold a community together or break it. So the instructions of Shurapak reads like a manual for staying intact, which makes its claim powerful, not because it proves a flood, because it reveals how Mesopotamian culture thought about knowledge. They did not just preserve math tables and star records, they preserved everyday wisdom and wrapped it in a frame that says this comes from far remote years. The repetition is part of the effect. Those far remote days, those far remote nights, those far remote years. It is a deliberate insistence on distance. This is not just old, it is older than normal memory, and the scribes kept copying it for centuries, for more than 1,000 years in some cases, not rewriting it to modernize it, not trimming it to make it more fashionable, copying it as a canonical text. That tells you something about the culture. They valued continuity more than freshness, and they believed wisdom was inherited. The scribal curriculum reinforces that. Students learned by copying, not just copying to learn handwriting, but copying to absorb the tradition. Lexical lists, long catalogues of trees, stones, animals, gods, tools, professions. These are not random lists, they are knowledge systems, taxonomies, ways of organising the world. Then literature, hymns, narratives, proverbs and wisdom texts. The goal was not individual originality, the goal was mastery of what the culture already considered authoritative. So when the instructions of Shurapak shows up in multiple copies across time, it is doing more than teaching advice. It is demonstrating a mechanism. Knowledge survives because it is copied. Knowledge survives because it is treated as sacred in its own way. And knowledge is seen as something you receive, not something you make up on the spot. Now here is the pressure point. You can say fine. It is wisdom literature. It uses a dramatic framing device. A father speaking to a son who will survive the flood. A classic story hook. That is one interpretation. But the persistence of the framing matters. The scribes could have copied the advice without tying it to Yusudra. They could have stripped away the pre-flood claim. They did not. They kept the claim, which suggests the claim served a purpose beyond entertainment. It positioned the wisdom as ancient, authoritative, and therefore reliable. And that leads to another question that sits under almost everything in Mesopotamian intellectual life. Why were they so obsessed with anchoring knowledge in the deep past? It is not just this text, it is a pattern. Kings restore temples by finding ancient foundations. Astronomers preserve old observations. Mathematicians copy standard tables. Scribes maintain a dead scholarly language because the old texts are in that language. Even when it is no longer spoken, it remains required. A scribe who does not know Sumerian, what kind of scribe is he? That is a statement of identity, not just communication. Identity as a preserver of ancient knowledge. So the instructions of Shurapak fits into the same worldview. Civilization is not something you reinvent. It is something you inherit. The job of the educated class is not to innovate, but to keep the chain unbroken. And if you believe catastrophe can break the chain, you treat copying as survival. There is another subtle detail. The advice in the instructions is social engineering. It is a set of guidelines for producing stable citizens. If you want a society to function, you need people to restrain themselves, to respect obligations, to avoid reckless guarantees, to be careful with speech, to manage reputation, to avoid conflict. This is the kind of wisdom that emerges after a society has already experienced breakdown. You do not get this kind of advice in a community that has never dealt with complex social systems. You get it when social systems exist and people keep breaking them, which suggests a long background of lived experience. Again, you cannot prove that background came from a lost era, but the text strongly implies a mature environment. And the act of copying it for centuries implies that later Mesopotamians believed that maturity belonged to an ancient source. They treated the wisdom like an heirloom, a tool, a foundation. And then you notice something else. The flood narratives in Mesopotamia often emphasize preservation of life and preservation of crafts. Not just animals, not just seeds. Craftsmen, techniques, skills. That detail is not accidental if your culture sees itself as maintaining a tradition through ruptures. The flood becomes the symbolic maximum rupture, the biggest possible break, and the hero of the story becomes a bridge, not just a survivor, but a carrier of life and of knowledge. So when Shurupak instructs Yusudra, it feels like a deliberate handoff. You carry this, you remember this, you do not let this die. And the scribes centuries later participate in that handoff every time they copy the text. They become part of the same chain. A chain reaching back to far remote days, whether those days are literal history or a cultural way of naming the deep origin of authority. Either way, the practical outcome is the same. Preservation becomes sacred. Now, if you want to press this even further, you step away from advice and proverbs and look at something that touches the body directly. Healing. Because medicine is another place where a culture reveals what it believes about knowledge. If you have effective treatments, you protect them. If you believe those treatments came from sacred sources, you preserve them with even more seriousness. And in Mesopotamia, the medical tradition does something familiar. It appears organized. It appears professional. It appears confident. And it does not show you the messy early experiments you would expect to find if this were a field being invented from scratch. It looks like another system that is being transmitted. When you picture ancient medicine, it is easy to imagine superstition first. Charms, incantations, fear of spirits, a healer waving smoke and muttering words while a patient quietly suffers. Mesopotamian medical tablets complicate that picture. They still include prayer and ritual language, sometimes, yes. But they also read like recipes, like procedural notes, like someone wrote down what worked because it mattered, because they wanted the next healer to do the same thing correctly. You see instructions for preparing treatments. Grind this resin, heat that bitumen, mix the ingredients in a specific ratio, apply it to a wound, wrap it in cloth, return after a set amount of time. You see approaches to physical intervention, drain an abscess, clean the wound, bandage it, immobilize a limb, check healing. You see diagnostic thinking, observe symptoms, compare patterns, predict likely outcomes, differentiate between conditions that look similar. That is not modern medicine. The theory is not modern. The explanations for disease can involve divine causes. But the method, the habit of recording and repeating effective practice, feels closer to empirical craft than to pure magic. And again, the same question rises. Where is the learning curve? Because when you find a field being invented, you expect to see an early stage that is messy. You expect wrong turns, experiments that fail, treatments that make no sense, random mixtures. What you often see in Mesopotamian medicine is a structured tradition, a pharmacological toolkit, a professional identity, a standardized way of talking about symptoms and outcomes. This becomes especially clear in the great diagnostic tradition that later Assyrian and Babylonian scholars preserved in large libraries. They organized the body systematically, head to foot, symptom clusters, prognosis, outcome prediction. Even when the attribution is phrased as hand of a god, the underlying structure is still clinical. If these symptoms appear together, expect this outcome. If the symptom shifts in this way, expect that outcome. This is pattern recognition formalized into text. And that is not the work of a single clever person improvising. It is the product of many observations collected and preserved. So the puzzle is not whether Mesopotamian healers were competent. The evidence suggests they often were. The puzzle is how the tradition appears so established, so early with so little evidence of the gradual accumulation stage. You can argue that the early experimentation happened in a time or medium that did not survive. That is possible. People could have used perishable notes, oral teaching memory, and practice for centuries, and only later did the tradition get written into clay in a more formal way. But if that is the answer, it requires an enormous invisible period of development, a fully functioning medical culture operating without the written evidence we would normally expect to accompany a complex knowledge system. And then there is another detail that makes the Mesopotamian medical tradition feel more sophisticated than people assume. The integration of mind and body. Many prescriptions include a spoken formula or ritual instruction alongside a physical treatment. It is tempting to split those into real medicine and superstition, but the combination might be more deliberate than that. A patient who believes a healer has power will often respond better to treatment. A patient who feels calm will heal more easily than one trapped in panic. A patient who trusts the healer is more likely to follow instructions, return for follow-ups, and allow uncomfortable procedures. A ritual, even if it does nothing physically, can create a psychological container for healing. It signals seriousness. It signals authority. It signals safety. So the spoken portion of a treatment can be seen as part of the therapeutic method, not a replacement for physical care. That is a nuanced practice, a recognition that healing is not only chemical and mechanical, but relational. Then you step back and ask another question. How do you maintain a medical tradition across centuries? You need training. You need apprenticeships. You need continuity. You need a way to ensure that new healers learn the right procedures and do not invent reckless variations that kill patients. Mesopotamia had those mechanisms. Professional roles existed, texts existed, students copied, teachers corrected. The same scribal culture that preserved literature and math also preserved medical knowledge. And the legal environment also shaped behaviour. A physician was not just a village-wise person. There were social expectations. There were professional standards. Outcomes mattered. All of that implies institutional structure. Now, if you look across the broader knowledge landscape, medicine fits the same shape as the other systems, not just preserved, formalized, not just practiced, recorded. not just recorded, standardized. Which brings you to the place where all of these systems meet. Education. Because you cannot have stable standards without a stable pipeline of people trained to maintain them. And in Mesopotamia, that pipeline had a name. The Aduba, the tablet house. You can picture it without much effort. A room or courtyard where students sit with damp clay. A teacher moving among them. A student pressing signs and getting them wrong. A teacher correcting by scraping or rewriting. The discipline can be harsh. The standards are high. And the result is a class of people whose job is to carry knowledge forward without breaking it. The Aduba curriculum is not centered on creativity, it is centered on mastery. The first stage is signs. Students copy and recopy basic cuneiform signs until their hands stop shaking and their lines become consistent. Then come lexical lists, lists of trees, stones, animals, professions, gods, tools. These lists are not just vocabulary, they are a way of structuring the world, a way of saying here is reality categorized, here is the map of things. The map of then mathematics, multiplication tables, reciprocal tables, problem sets, geometric calculations, surveying exercises. Again, the student is not discovering. The student is being trained to apply a system that already exists. Then literature, hymns, myths, wisdom texts, royal inscriptions. Not because the student is expected to become a poet, but because the student must master the authoritative language of the culture, especially the old language. Sumerian becomes a scholarly language even when daily speech shifts. That is not casual. That is a decision. It says the past matters enough that you preserve it intact. And that decision has consequences. It creates continuity. It keeps old texts readable across centuries. It keeps ritual formulae stable. It keeps administrative terms precise. It keeps mathematical procedures consistent. It keeps temple instructions transmissible. So when you ask how Mesopotamian knowledge could remain recognizable across massive political shifts, the Aduba is one of the most practical answers. It is a machine for producing continuity. But the Aduba also raises a different question, one that lands right in the middle of this entire investigation. If your education system is built almost entirely on copying and preservation, it suggests you believe the knowledge is already complete or already authoritative. You're not training students to invent. You are training them to keep the system alive. That is the mindset of a culture that believes it is an inheritor. Now consider what the students were copying. Some texts were already old when they were being copied. Some were already treated as classics. Some were written in forms of language that had become archaic. And yet they were still required. Why? Because old knowledge carried status. It carried legitimacy. It carried power. That is true in many cultures. But in Mesopotamia, the attachment to ancientness is unusually strong. It is reinforced by their stories about where knowledge comes from. Teachers from outside ordinary human society, divine wisdom, sages, principles of civilization that can be possessed and transferred. This is not just a poetic flourish. It shapes what the culture thinks education is for. Education is not self-expression. It is preservation of the system that keeps the world ordered. And when you combine that with the flood boundary that appears in their historical framework, the emphasis makes even more sense. A culture that remembers catastrophic rupture will develop a deeper obsession with continuity. A culture that fears loss will become a culture that copies. Now there is one more layer to this educational system that often gets overlooked, and it matters because it links knowledge to control. Administrative power. Scribes did not just write stories, they ran society. They tracked grain deliveries, labour quotas, temple offerings, legal contracts, property transfers. They wrote down who owed what to whom. They wrote down the official record. If you control writing, you control memory. If you control memory, you control legitimacy. So scribal culture becomes political culture. Kings rely on scribes. Temples rely on scribes. Courts rely on scribes. Trade relies on scribes, which means the preservation of knowledge is not only intellectual, it is structural. Civilization depends on it. And that takes you back to a basic observation. In Mesopotamia, knowledge appears early in ways that look complete. Writing is used for complex administration almost immediately. Math is applied in standardized forms. Astronomy becomes a tool for timekeeping and ritual coordination. Medicine becomes a professional craft. Temple building follows fixed plans. And the aduba trains people to keep it all running. So if you ask, why does civilization seem to arrive quickly in the archaeological record, part of the answer may be that once a certain threshold is crossed, these systems reinforce each other. Writing allows administration. Administration allows surplus control. Surplus control allows specialization. Specialization allows observation programs, medical apprenticeships, architectural planning, and education keeps everything consistent. That is one explanation, but it still leaves another question hanging. How did the first generation get the complete template? How did the earliest stage of the system reach a point where it could train others in a standardized curriculum? Why does it look like the curriculum was designed to conserve something already established? That is where Mesopotamian tradition points to teachers. Not teachers in a classroom, teachers from far remote times tied to the first cities, tied to the first temple, tied to the deep waters of wisdom. Figures described not as creators of humans, but as instructors of humans. Knowledge transmitters, civilizers. And when you gather the repeated claims across their myths and rituals, you begin to see that the culture did not imagine itself climbing slowly upward. It imagined itself receiving. Which brings you to the strange, persistent names that show up whenever Mesopotamia talks about the origin of skills. The sages, the ones described as having brought the arts of civilization, the ones tied to the earliest kings, the ones linked to the deep waters, to the temple city, to the idea that knowledge descended instead of being invented. The story of the sages does not read like a casual myth. It reads like a cultural memory that refuses to die. Across Mesopotamian tradition, you keep encountering the same basic claim: the arts of civilization were taught, not discovered by accident, not invented by a lucky genius. Taught, and the teachers are described as unusual, not because the culture needed monsters to entertain itself, but because the culture needed a way to express something difficult to explain. How does a society suddenly possess writing mathematics, astronomy, temple, geometry, measurement systems, and professional medicine? If you are living inside that society and you can feel how complete your systems are, you might not think of them as freshly invented. You might think of them as received. So the tradition points to instructors, sages associated with the god of deep wisdom, figures tied to early kings, beings described as emerging from the waters or wearing fish garments or carrying the marks of something not quite human. Now, in modern terms, you can interpret this any way you want. You can see it as myth. You can see it as allegory. You can see it as a narrative device. But what matters is the function. The tradition is a map of how Mesopotamians understood knowledge origin. Knowledge comes from outside the ordinary human process. It comes from a source that already possesses it. It is delivered through a chain. It is preserved. It survives rupture, and then it is applied again. That is the model, and the sages fit this model perfectly. They are not creators of humans. Humans already exist. They are not inventors in the modern sense. They do not tinker and experiment. They are transmitters. Their job is instruction. Their job is to take something complete and place it into human hands. If you listen closely, the language of Mesopotamian tradition keeps returning to this idea. Plans are revealed. Principles descend. Kingship is lowered from heaven. Civilizing powers are possessed and transferred. The words themselves are directional, downward, from above to below, from older to newer, from hidden to visible, from divine to human, from origin to application. And this is important because the sages are connected to very specific things, not vague spiritual goodness, specific skills, writing, counting, measuring, building, organizing. You see this in the way Mesopotamia treats the me, the principles that make civilization possible. They are described almost like tools that can be carried, stored, stolen, redistributed. That is a weird framing if knowledge is seen as something you gradually figure out. But it makes sense if knowledge is seen as something that exists independently of you, something that can be given. Now step into the most famous version of the teacher story. A figure described as coming from the sea, spending the day among humans, teaching and then returning to the water at night. Again, the imagery is strange, but the message is direct. An outsider with complete knowledge arrived and trained people. The outsider did not just teach one craft. The outsider taught the whole package. How to write, how to build, how to farm, how to measure, how to govern, how to create law, how to stabilize social life. That is not a random list. It is exactly the list you would make if you were describing the core functions that define civilization. And the sea detail is also interesting. If you strip away the literal reading, the sea becomes a symbol of elsewhere. It becomes a way of saying this knowledge came from beyond our land, beyond our normal experience. It came from a source we cannot easily describe. If the teachers were migrants from another region, the sea could represent arrival by boat, arrival by water routes. If the teachers were survivors from a catastrophe, the sea could represent the flood itself, the waters that divided history. If the teachers were an older priestly lineage, maintaining knowledge through dark times, the sea could represent secrecy, depth, hiddenness. You can interpret it in multiple ways without breaking the basic idea. Knowledge arrived from outside the ordinary process and was transmitted through teaching. Now there is something else that gives this tradition weight. It appears alongside the practical evidence of a culture that really did behave like preservers. When a king rebuilds a temple, he seeks the old foundation. He looks for the correct ancient plan. He claims to restore the proper form. When scribes educate students, they make them copy classics. They treat old language as essential. When scholars record astronomical data, they maintain long-term archives. When healers transmit medical practice, they write recipes and diagnostic series. This behaviour matches the teacher worldview. If you believe knowledge was given, you treat it as sacred. You treat it as dangerous to lose. You treat it as your responsibility to keep it intact. And then you look again at the biggest boundary marker in the tradition, the flood. In Mesopotamian memory, the flood is not only a disaster story, it is a knowledge story. It is a test of whether the arts of civilization can survive. And that is why so many flood narratives emphasize preserving more than life, preserving crafts, preserving seeds, preserving the means to rebuild, because the fear is not death alone. The fear is forgetting how to build, forgetting how to measure, forgetting how to heal, forgetting how to organize time, forgetting how to keep a city alive. Now, if you want a purely mainstream reading, you can say the flood is a metaphor for chaos, a symbol for political collapse, a memory of regional disasters. That is fair. But even inside that reading, the emphasis on knowledge preservation remains real. It is not incidental. The flood is framed as a rupture in civilization, not just a rupture in population, which means the hero is framed as a carrier of civilization, and the sages are framed as the ones who provided civilization in the first place. So the tradition is structurally coherent. Teachers give knowledge. A catastrophe threatens knowledge. A remnant preserves knowledge. Civilization resumes, and the scribes continue the chain. That coherence does not prove that fish-clad beings walked out of the Gulf and taught farmers how to calculate triangles. But it does prove something else. It proves that Mesopotamians believed civilization had an origin story that was not human invention in the ordinary sense. They believed civilization was a transmission event. Now here is where the investigation tightens, because when you compare the tradition to the archaeological transition that bothers historians, you see why this worldview might have taken hold. In the long stretch of village life, you can have gradual development, more complex irrigation, more specialized pottery, larger houses, some communal buildings. Then in a compressed window, you suddenly have cities, urban planning, temples on a huge scale, administrative accounting, writing, standardized measurement, long-distance exchange, professional classes. So the culture itself, looking back, could easily perceive that as a moment of reception, not because they were stupid, but because the transformation feels like a leap. And if your society sees a leap, it will create a story that explains the leap. A story with teachers, a story with divine authority, a story that anchors legitimacy. Because if your king is ruling because kingship descended, then your king is not just powerful. Your king is rightful. If your priesthood is powerful because it holds the ancient knowledge, then your priesthood is not just influential, it is necessary. If your scribal class is elite because it preserves the old texts, then your scribal class is not just educated, it is the guardian of civilization. So the tradition does multiple jobs at once. It explains sudden complexity, it legitimizes institutions, it motivates preservation, it creates identity, and it frames knowledge as something ancient and precious. Now, if you want to understand why the sages remain so important, you have to look at what happens when institutions collapse. Because Mesopotamia did experience collapse many times. Cities fell, dynasties ended, empires rose, empires shattered, and yet knowledge persisted. Texts were copied, records were maintained. Curricula survived, astronomical series continued, temple forms stayed recognizable. That persistence is astonishing on its own. It suggests an obsessive commitment to continuity, and that commitment is easier to understand when the culture believes that what it has is not easily replaceable. If you think you invented writing, you might believe you could reinvent it. If you think writing was given by sages and gods, you might believe you cannot reinvent it. You can only preserve it. So preservation becomes a survival strategy. And that leads directly to the final pressure point. The problem is not only the myths. The problem is the pattern of complete systems appearing early, and a culture insisting those systems were transmitted Modern scholarship can dismiss the teacher story as mythology, but the dismissal does not remove the pattern that gave rise to the story. The pattern remains, and the pattern demands an explanation. At this point, you have a handful of possible paths. One path says the early stages existed but have not been found. Another path says the early stages happened on perishable materials that did not survive. Another path says knowledge came from somewhere else through migration or exchange. Another path says the ancient people were blending symbolic time with historical time, and the teacher stories are poetic authority. And another path says the culture might be remembering a transmission event from a period or place that our evidence does not yet reach. No matter which path you prefer, one thing is clear. Mesopotamia did not imagine itself inventing civilization from scratch. It imagined itself receiving. And now you arrive at the most uncomfortable part of the investigation, the place where modern models start to strain. Because once you accept that the culture saw itself as an inheritor, the kingless numbers stop being an isolated oddity. They become another expression of the same worldview, a history that begins not with trial and error, but with kingship descending. A timeline that begins not with village growth, but with a complete system arriving. And a flood that functions not as mythic drama, but as the line where everything breaks and then resumes. So the question becomes less about a single tablet and more about the model itself. What if civilization, at least in Mesopotamian memory, is not a straight line? What if it is a cycle of loss and restoration? If that were true, then the sudden appearance of complete systems would not be an anomaly. It would be the expected signature of a restoration event. And the emphasis on sages and teaching would not be a mythic flourish. It would be a cultural description of how knowledge survived. To press that idea, you need to examine the pivot point that sits in the middle of their history like a gate. The flood, not as a global event, not as a literal measurement of the entire planet, but as a boundary in the record that separates one kind of time from another, and one kind of knowledge continuity from another. Because the next question is simple, and it is harder than it sounds. If there was a rupture, what exactly crossed it? Who carried what? And how much of civilization can survive a collapse without needing to be reinvented? Imagine a flood not as water rising in a single afternoon, but as the slow collapse of certainty. The river breaks its banks, the canals overflow, fields disappear under silt, houses soften and slump, storage jars tip, grain rots, fires die, roads vanish. The horizon becomes a flat sheet of grey. In a landscape like southern Mesopotamia, a flood does not have to cover the whole world to end a world. If you live on the alluvial plain, your entire economy is a fragile agreement with water. Too little water and you starve. Too much water and your city dissolves. So when Mesopotamian texts place a flood at the centre of their chronology, that is not automatically unbelievable. It is psychologically accurate. A regional flood can become the defining boundary of a culture because it is the kind of event that separates memory into two categories. The life that existed before it and the life that had to be rebuilt after. Now the key question is not whether water once rose in the region. Archaeology shows that it did in multiple places at multiple times. The key question is what the culture believed crossed the boundary. Because if the flood is a divider, then survival becomes more than survival of bodies. It becomes survival of systems. You can picture the kinds of knowledge that can vanish quickly. The location of a boundary stone that defines a field. The the precise ratio for mixing bitumen in waterproofing, the method for calculating an area when a plot is irregular, the correct order of ritual steps that makes a temple offering legitimate, the names of months and the logic of intercalating an extra one, the procedure for setting a broken bone without crippling someone for life. If you lose those, you do not just lose comfort, you lose coordination, you lose authority, you lose the ability to make society function as something more than scattered families. So if a culture becomes obsessed with continuity, it makes sense that it would invest in preservation technology. And in Mesopotamia, preservation technology is clay. Clay is everywhere. Clay is cheap. Clay is durable when baked or hardened by accidental fire. Clay is heavy, inconvenient, and nearly perfect for long-term memory. A papyrus note can burn, a leather scroll can rot, a wooden tablet can split. A clay tablet can sit in dirt for 3,000 years and come back with its mark still sharp. So if you wanted to carry knowledge across uncertain times, clay is a logical choice. You can feel the shift in the culture once writing becomes central. Records become archives. Archives become libraries. Libraries become the backbone of administration. And administration becomes the spine that lets civilization stand upright. Now consider the flood narratives again, but focus only on what they consistently emphasize. A warning, a construction, a gathering, a sealing, a survival, a release, an offering, a return. These steps are more than drama. They are a model of knowledge preservation. A warning implies foresight. Construction implies technical capacity. Gathering implies selection. You choose what must be saved. Sealing implies an understanding of materials and engineering. Survival implies continuity. Release implies rebuilding. Offering implies restoration of order between humans and the powers they believe govern the world. Return implies resumption, not reinvention. Now, if you hold that model in your mind, you can ask a sharper question. If you had to rebuild a civilization from a remnant, what would you prioritize? You would need seeds. You would need breeding animals. You would need tools. You would need craftsmen. You would need specialists who know how to organize labor. You would need rituals that re-establish legitimacy. And you would need the knowledge that ties all of it together. Measurements, calendars, accounting, writing, temple plans, law codes. If even a portion of that survives intact, the rebuilt civilization can look sudden to a later archaeologist, because the archaeologist sees the first visible layer of the rebuild and assumes it must represent invention. But a rebuild can appear complete quickly if the blueprint was not lost. That is the restoration hypothesis in its simplest form. Not a claim that everything was preserved perfectly, not a claim that nothing changed, just a claim that enough survived that the rebuilt system could be deployed faster than ordinary invention would allow. Now, you do not need to accept mythological teachers to accept this idea. You only need to accept that knowledge can survive collapse if it is carried by a trained remnant. And the Mesopotamian record shows that trained remnants existed. Priests, scribes, administrators, craft specialists, people whose social role was already tied to preservation and procedure. Now consider what the flood boundary in the king list does. It separates the impossible reigns from the gradually normalizing reigns. Whatever those numbers mean, the structure is consistent. The flood is a hinge, and the hinge implies that something changes in the nature of time itself. Before time is not measured in ordinary human scale, after time becomes progressively more human. That pattern can be read symbolically, yes, but it can also be read as cultural language for a gap. A break in continuity so severe that it feels like the previous world was different in kind. People do this even today. They talk about before the war and after the war. They talk about before the collapse and after the collapse. They talk about before everything changed. And when people speak that way, they are not making a geological claim. They are describing how memory behaves. So the flood becomes a mark where the world is no longer the same. And when the world is no longer the same, you begin to mythologize what existed on the other side. It becomes larger. It becomes brighter. It becomes older. It becomes more powerful. It becomes a time when gods walked closer, when knowledge was purer, when kingship was more direct. This is one way impossible reign lengths can emerge. Not because someone tried to trick future historians, but because the memory of rupture makes the old world feel distant beyond ordinary counting. But again, there is the stubborn detail. The numbers are preserved in a document that behaves like an administrative record, and scribes who could calculate barley rations still copied those impossible spans. So you are left with the tension. Either the numbers are symbolic, but then why are they treated with such administrative seriousness? Or the numbers reflect a measurement system or conceptual framework we do not fully understand. Or the numbers reflect inherited traditions that scribes preserved, even when they did not know how to reconcile them with practical timekeeping. Now step away from the numbers and return to the mechanism. How do you preserve a blueprint? You need a place, a protected institution, a site that survives even when political power shifts. In Mesopotamian imagination, that place is often Eridu, the city that is described as first, the temple built over deep waters, the seat of wisdom. Whether or not you treat that as literal geography, the symbolism is clear. There is a centre of continuity. There is a repository. There is a place where knowledge is stored. And if you want an archaeological expression of that idea, the Temple Mound works perfectly. A temple is not just a building, it is an archive. It holds rituals. It holds calendar knowledge. It holds measurement standards. It holds staff roles. It holds inherited plans. It holds economic power through offerings and land. So when a culture rebuilds after disruption, the temple is often the first institution to reassert itself, because it brings order, it brings legitimacy, it brings coordination, it brings the feeling that the world is again aligned. Now take one more step and imagine how a remnant might carry knowledge, not in a single book, in practices, in habits, in standardized procedures, in the way you measure a wall, in the way you lay out a room, in the way you mark a seal, in the way you count time, in the way you train apprentices. These are forms of embodied knowledge. Even if you lose a library, you can carry these procedures in memory and rebuild the archive later. If enough specialists survive, the system can come back quickly. Now, does that mean there was a fully advanced civilization before the flood? Not necessarily. It could mean a smaller but already sophisticated network. It could mean certain crafts were highly developed and survived. It could mean that temple institutions maintained a knowledge core through multiple disruptions. It could mean that the flood memory is a composite of many catastrophes layered into one grand boundary story. Any of these could be true. What matters is that the Mesopotamian model of civilization is compatible with restoration. And restoration explains something that otherwise feels strange. The sudden appearance of complete systems, a civilization that looks like it arrived with a toolkit, rather than discovering each tool one by one. Now, if you want to stress test this, you need to ask what should be visible if restoration occurred. You would expect continuity in sacred sites. You would expect repeated rebuilding on the same axis. You would expect the same templates used again. You would expect measurement standards that remain stable. You would expect early writing to be administrative, because administration is what you need to restore order. You would expect education to emphasize copying because copying is how you prevent drift. You would expect traditions to insist that knowledge was given because knowledge that survived collapse feels like inheritance. And you would expect the flood narratives to focus on preserving crafts because crafts are what makes restoration possible. Now compare that list to what we see. Sacred sites rebuilt repeatedly with consistent alignment. Writing appearing first as accounting and administration, measurement standards that stabilize early, education centered on preservation, myths framed as knowledge transmission, flood narratives focused on survival of techniques and social order. It fits, not perfectly, but enough to make you pause. Now the next pressure point is the transition from recovery villages to full cities. If restoration is the mechanism, then the long village period can be read as a slow climb back to capacity, population growth, irrigation stabilization, social coordination, and then once the threshold is reached, the stored blueprint is deployed. Urbanization is not invented in that moment, it is activated. Again, you do not need to believe in supernatural teachers to entertain this as a possibility. You only need to accept that institutions can preserve knowledge in a latent state until conditions allow expansion. And that is something humans do constantly. A family preserves a craft across generations. A guild preserves a technique. A priesthood preserves a ritual calendar. A scholarly tradition preserves old language. A culture preserves its identity. All of that is preservation. And preservation is what makes restoration possible. So the flood boundary becomes less about proving a single historical event and more about understanding a cultural structure. A people who saw themselves as crossing a break. A people who valued memory because they feared forgetting. A people who built systems designed to survive ruin. And now you arrive at the most important question for the next movement of this script. If restoration is even partly true, then which parts of civilization are easiest to carry across a collapse, and which parts are hardest? Because the answer to that will tell you what kind of remnant could rebuild quickly, and why certain systems appear complete at the beginning of the record. And it will also tell you why the scribes of all people became so central. Because if you want to carry a blueprint across uncertain times, you do not need an army. You need a memory class. You need people whose job is to remember accurately. You need the ones who can press the marks into clay and keep the system from drifting. So the next step is to enter that memory class more deeply. Not only how they were trained, but what they considered sacred enough to preserve, and why their obsession with accuracy might be the most important clue of all. There is a moment when you realise the scribes were not simply record keepers, they were the infrastructure. If you want to understand why Mesopotamian knowledge feels so stable across long stretches of time, you have to stop thinking about writing as a tool and start thinking about writing as a class system. A society can invent a script and still lose it quickly if the script is casual. If anyone can write, if no one is paid to preserve. If copying is sloppy, if archives are temporary, then the script dies with the generation that uses it. Mesopotamia built the opposite. They built a controlled pipeline. They built a professional identity around literacy. They built a curriculum that trained accuracy, not creativity. They built schools that treated copying as sacred labour. And they built a social ladder that rewarded the people who could keep the marks clean. So when you ask how knowledge survives, you do not only look at temples and myths. You look at the classroom. You look at the way a student learns to shape a sign. You look at the way a teacher punishes a mistake. You look at the way a young hand is trained to respect the old forms. Because this is where preservation becomes physical. A boy or a girl sits with a lump of clay and a reed stylus. The clay is wet and forgiving, which means errors are easy. But errors are also visible, and visibility is the whole point. So the training emphasizes form. Not only what the sign means, but how it looks. Not only what a number represents, but how it sits in a column. Not only the word, but the spacing. Not only the calculation, but the layout. Because a tablet is not a casual note. It is an artifact meant to last. And if it is meant to last, then the person who writes it must be trained to last too. This is why the lexical lists matter so much. Those lists can look boring to modern eyes. Trees, stones, fish, birds, tools, professions. But if you think like a system builder, those lists are a database. They are a structured way to anchor language to the world. They are a controlled vocabulary. They make sure that when a scribe in one city writes the name of a tree, a scribe in another city can recognize it. They reduce ambiguity. They standardize knowledge. And once knowledge is standardized, it can travel. It can cross distance. It can cross generations. It can cross political changes. It can cross collapse. So the scribal lists are not trivia. They are an attempt to freeze the categories of reality. And if you freeze categories, you freeze administrative capacity. You freeze tax collection. You freeze legal contracts. You freeze trade standards. You freeze calendar reckoning. You freeze the entire nervous system of civilization. Now consider the mathematics training again, but focus on the behavior, not the math. A student does not invent a multiplication table. A student copies it. The table is already authoritative. It is already arranged. It is already standard. The student learns to reproduce it correctly, and that reproduction is treated as competence. This is not education designed to produce innovators. This is education designed to produce continuity. And that is the key. If your civilization believes that knowledge came from ancient sources, your education system will not focus on invention. It will focus on faithful transmission, because invention implies that the ancients were incomplete, and the entire Mesopotamian worldview resists that idea. The older is not primitive, the older is authoritative. The older is closer to the origin, the older is closer to the gods. So the goal is to align with the older. In practical terms, this creates a cultural habit that keeps systems stable. Now think about what this does to time. If you have a stable scribal tradition, you can maintain long calendars. You can preserve astronomical series. You can keep consistent measurement standards. You can compile medical handbooks. And you can copy old king lists without changing their structure, even if parts of them feel strange. Because the list is not merely information, it is legitimacy. It is the official spine of history. And if the spine is damaged, the whole body becomes weak. So you preserve it. Even if it contains things you cannot reconcile. Especially if it contains things you cannot reconcile, because that is precisely what makes it ancient. Now here is a subtle thing that modern readers often miss. Conservatism in education is not automatically a sign of stagnation. In a world where catastrophe is possible, conservatism is a survival strategy. If floods destroy archives, if cities fall, if libraries burn, then you want redundancy. You want many students copying the same text. You want many tablets in many places. You want the same material repeated, not because repetition is boring, but because repetition is insurance. So the scribal system multiplies the memory. It creates backups. One city is destroyed, another still has copies. One library burns, another still holds the series. One language becomes archaic, but scribes maintain it anyway, because archaic language is the container of ancient authority. This is why Sumerian remains a scholarly language, even after it is no longer spoken. Not because it is convenient, but because it is sacred to the tradition. A scribe who cannot read Sumerian is not simply missing vocabulary. They are missing access to the oldest layer of knowledge. They are cut off from the origin. And in Mesopotamia, being cut off from the origin is not a minor inconvenience. It is a threat. So the scribes maintain the ancient tongue as a bridge. Now step into the social role of the scribe. A scribe is not just someone who writes. A scribe is a gatekeeper. A scribe can validate a contract. A scribe can record a debt. A scribe can list rations. A scribe can document land boundaries. A scribe can write the words that make a law enforceable. A scribe can control what the official record says. And in a society where the record is reality, that is power. So scribes become the quiet rulers behind the loud rulers. Kings change. Scribes persist. Dynasties collapse. Scribes still teach. Languages shift. Scribes preserve the old form. Empires conquer. Scribes adapt and keep copying. That continuity is exactly what you would expect if a civilization sees itself as maintaining received knowledge. Now here is where it gets even more interesting, because the scribes did not only preserve information, they preserved methods. A mathematical tablet does not only store answers, it stores procedure. An astronomical series does not only store observations, it stores how to observe. A medical handbook does not only store prescriptions, it stores technique. A legal contract does not only store an agreement, it stores a format. And formats are a kind of invisible technology. A civilization that preserves formats can rebuild quickly, because when you have a format, you have a template. And when you have a template, you can scale. You can train new people. You can apply the same structure across many cases. You can turn individual knowledge into institutional knowledge. So the scribal schools are factories for templates. They mass produce the habits of civilization. Now think about this in relation to the sudden appearance of complexity. If the templates were preserved quietly through a long recovery period, then once conditions allow expansion, those templates can spread rapidly. A few trained scribes can organize a city because they can replicate the system. They can train assistants. They can enforce standards. They can create documents that coordinate labor. They can build an administrative machine. And that machine can make a city behave like a city, even if the population only recently reached the necessary size. So the scribal class becomes the lever that turns population growth into complexity. Not because scribes are magical, but because they are the ones who know the code. Now the question becomes, where did the code come from? Because even if you explain preservation, you still have to explain origin. How do you get the first generation of templates? How do you get a writing system that already supports sophisticated accounting? How do you get measurement standards that are already consistent? How do you get mathematical procedures that are already stable? How do you get a curriculum that is already standardized across multiple cities? You can say it developed locally. You can say it developed rapidly. You can say it developed earlier in perishable form and then moved to clay. You can say it arrived from elsewhere. You can say it survived a rupture. But whatever you choose, the scribal system tells you something crucial. This civilization was built to preserve. It was built to maintain. It was built to carry. So even if you do not accept the ancient stories as literal, you can still accept their psychological and institutional truth. Mesopotamia acted like a civilization that believed knowledge was inherited and fragile, and that belief shaped everything. It shaped how they taught. It shaped how they wrote. It shaped how they built archives. It shaped how they looked at the past. And it shaped how they framed origin. Now there is one more layer here that brings the whole thing into focus. The scribes were not preserving only technical knowledge. They were preserving legitimacy narratives, king lists, flood boundaries, descent of kingship, teacher myths. These are not separate from administration. They are part of administration because administration needs authority. A city is not only bricks, it is agreement. An agreement is easier to enforce when people believe the system has cosmic sanction. So the scribes preserve the cosmic story alongside the ration ledger. They preserve the genealogy alongside the tax record. They preserve the myth alongside the measurement table. Because the myth tells you why the measurement table matters. The myth tells you why the calendar is sacred. The myth tells you why the temple is aligned a certain way. The myth tells you why the king is legitimate. And that is how a civilization maintains itself. Not only through knowledge, but through meaning. Now, to move forward, you have to look at a particular kind of text that sits at the intersection of meaning and technique. Texts that do not only describe the world, but organize it. Texts that do not only record data, but create categories that define what can be known. Because those categories might hold the most important clue about the origin problem. If the categories appear complete early, then the civilization did not only inherit tools, it inherited a worldview, a way of sorting reality, a way of naming, a way of structuring time, a way of structuring legitimacy. And if that worldview was inherited, the question becomes sharper than ever. Who handed them the first set of categories? And why did those categories arrive already powerful enough to shape human civilization for thousands of years? Picture a city not as walls and streets, but as a set of agreements. Who owns what? Who owes what? Who is allowed to speak for the gods? Who has the right to punish? Who can move grain from one storehouse to another without being accused of theft? These agreements are invisible. You cannot excavate them like bricks, but you can excavate the paper trail. And in Mesopotamia, that paper trail is clay. When you start looking at the earliest tablets, a strange thing happens. They do not read like experimental scribbles. They read like the output of an institution that already knows what questions matter. How many jars? How many sheep? How much barley? Which worker? Which day? Which storehouse? Which official seal? This is not writing as art. This is writing as control, and control requires categories. You cannot control what you cannot classify. So the earliest writing does something more important than record goods. It teaches a civilization how to think in lists, how to separate, how to quantify, how to standardize, how to make the messy world legible. Once a world is legible, it becomes governable. And once it becomes governable, it becomes scalable. Now here is the uncomfortable part. If the categories show are quickly, then the cognitive leap already happened. Because learning to count jars is one thing. Learning to turn a society into an inventory is another. That second leap is not purely technical. It is mental. It is a way of seeing. And once a way of seeing takes hold, it shapes everything. It shapes how you build. It shapes how you farm. It shapes how you measure time. It shapes how you punish. It shapes how you define legitimacy. So when you ask where the knowledge came from, you might be asking a question that is too narrow. You might not be looking only for the origin of writing, or the origin of math, or the origin of astronomy. You might be looking for the origin of a worldview that treats reality as something that can be organized into systems, because that worldview is what makes the technical systems possible. Now consider the concept of standardization. A weight system only works if everyone agrees to use it. A calendar only works if everyone agrees to mark the same months. A legal format only works if everyone agrees that the format is binding. A temple plan only works if everyone agrees that the orientation is sacred. Agreement at that scale is not automatic. It requires authority. And authority requires a story. so the oldest systems do not stand alone. They arrive braided together. Accounting, yes, but also seals. Writing, yes, but also temple institutions. Numbers, yes, but also legitimacy. This is why cylinder seals matter so much. A seal is a signature, but it is also a claim. It says this belongs to someone. It says this transaction is validated. It says this jar is not just a jar, it is part of an authorized flow. When a society begins using seals widely, it is telling you something. It is telling you that property and authority have become portable, not only held by brute force, but held by symbol. And when symbol becomes enforceable, you are seeing a civilization shift into a new mode. Now step into the temple again, but not as architecture, as an administrative engine. Temples in Mesopotamia are not only places to pray, they are warehouses, they are employers, they are land managers, they are financial institutions, they are educational centres, they are the place where offerings become stored goods. And stored goods become ration distributions. And ration distributions become labour control. So the temple is a machine that turns belief into logistics. And logistics requires record keeping. And record keeping requires standard categories. So the temple and the tablet evolved together. Not because religion invented writing, but because administration needed writing. And religion was the dominant administrative institution. So writing becomes sacred, not because it is mystical, but because it becomes the thing that holds order in place. Now, if you want to understand why certain knowledge systems appear fully functional early, think about what a temple machine needs to operate. It needs a calendar, because festivals and offerings are scheduled. It needs mathematics, because rations must be calculated, land must be surveyed, storage must be tracked. It needs writing, because the machine cannot rely on memory alone. It needs standards, because if one official counts a jar one way and another counts it another way, the whole system collapses into disputes. It needs trained specialists, because casual literacy produces drift. So as the temple machine grows, it naturally pulls multiple knowledge systems into an integrated package. If you have the institution, you get the bundle. And once the bundle exists, it spreads. Other cities adopt it. Other temples mirror it. Other administrations copy it. Scribes carry the package. Seals travel with merchants. Standards move with contracts. And soon you have a region that shares a common operating system. Now the origin question returns. How did the package become so coherent so early? Because coherence is not guaranteed. Most human systems develop with messy overlap, competing standards, local variations, conflicting calendars, different weights, different legal formats. Then slowly over time you see consolidation. But Mesopotamia often looks like it consolidated quickly, at least quickly compared to what we expect. Now there is a practical reason this can happen. If the primary institution, the temple, is both sacred and economic, it can impose standards faster. A merchant might resist a new weight system, but if the temple uses it for rations, and rations determine who eats the weight system, becomes non-negotiable. A farmer might dislike a calendar rule, but if the temple sets festival dates that control labour obligations and land management, the calendar becomes binding. A local official might prefer his own contract format, but if the temple courts only recognise one format, the others die out. So institutional power can create rapid standardisation. That is one explanation, but it still leaves the question of where the standards came from in the first place. Because even an institution must choose. It must decide which units to use, which calendar structure to follow, which signs to standardise, which seals to accept. Those decisions have to originate somewhere. Now consider another angle. A civilization does not only preserve knowledge that is useful, It also preserves knowledge that signals identity. Sumerian language in scribal schools is identity. The king list is identity. The flood boundary is identity. The idea that kingship descended is identity. The claim that knowledge was given is identity. Why? Because identity creates cohesion. A city-state is not only a political unit, it is a group of people who must believe they are part of one story. So the story is preserved with as much care as the math. And once the story is preserved, it can shape how people interpret their own systems. If you believe your standards were given by a divine source, you will preserve them more strictly. You will resist innovation. You will treat deviation as sacrilege. And that creates stability. A stability that can look like an ancient inheritance. Now there is a specific kind of text that reveals how deep this goes. Lists that do not only catalogue objects, but classify the entire world. Lists of gods. Lists of professions. Lists of cities. Lists of ritual offerings. Lists of star names. Lists of measurements. These lists are not entertainment. They are the backbone of a worldview. When you see a culture obsessively listing, you are seeing a culture trying to tame complexity. You are seeing a culture building a mental map. And once the mental map is built, everything else becomes easier. Because now you can coordinate. Now you can assign roles. Now you can budget. Now you can plan. Now you can predict. Now you can standardize. Now you can teach. So the emergence of list culture is as important as the emergence of writing itself. Because list culture is the cognitive style that makes a bureaucratic civilization possible. Now place this next to the idea of sudden completeness. If a list-based worldview appears rapidly, it could feel like a download. Not in a mystical sense, in a cultural sense. A new mode of thought that spreads through institutions and then becomes normal. And if that mode of thought was inherited from older sources, it would feel even more like a restoration, not just of techniques, but of categories. Now here is where you can feel the tension between modern and ancient models. Modern models prefer incremental change, but institutional change can be abrupt. When a new administrative system is imposed, it can transform life quickly. When a new measurement standard becomes mandatory, trade changes quickly. When a new writing system becomes required, memory changes quickly. When a new calendar is enforced, time changes quickly. So you can have a situation where an earlier period looks simple and then suddenly the record looks complex, not because the people became different overnight, but because the institution that organizes their life reached a threshold. It became strong enough to impose an integrated system. Now ask yourself, what could create that threshold? Population growth, yes. Agricultural surplus, yes. Trade networks, yes. But there is another factor, confidence. An institution only imposes strict standardization when it believes it has authority to enforce it. And authority is not only physical, it is ideological. It requires belief. It requires legitimacy. It requires a story that says, this is not just our preference, this is the correct order of the world. So when Mesopotamian texts insist that kingship descended, that standards came from divine wisdom, that temple plans were revealed, they are not only telling myths, they are establishing the ideological foundation that makes standardization enforceable. If you believe the plan is revealed, you do not negotiate it. If you believe the measurement is sacred, you do not alter it. If you believe the calendar reflects cosmic order, you do not casually change it. So the myth and the bureaucracy are a single machine. The myth legitimizes the standards. The standards make the myth practical. Together they create a civilization that can hold itself steady. Now the next step is to look at one of the hardest things to standardize. Not jars or sheep, not weights or measures, but time itself. because once a civilization standardizes time, it gains a new kind of power. It can coordinate labor. It can control festivals. It can plan harvests. It can predict eclipses. It can align temples. It can claim cosmic legitimacy. And if time standardization appears early and stable, it tells you something critical. It tells you that the civilization did not only learn to count, it learned to synchronize. And synchronization is where the mystery deepens, because synchronization requires a long memory, a memory that is careful, continuous and protected, a memory that does not drift, a memory class that watches the sky, keeps the calendar and teaches the next generation to do the same. So the next movement is into the sky again, but from a new angle. Not stars as wonder, stars as administration, stars as the machinery of time that makes a civilization operate like a single body. Time is the most expensive technology a civilization can build. Not clocks, not sundials, not even calendars on clay. The expensive part is the discipline. The expensive part is paying people to notice what everyone else ignores, to watch the horizon when it is cold, to mark the moon when it is thin, to record the first appearance of a star when most people are asleep or already working, to care about a pattern that might not pay off for years. That is why astronomy is never just astronomy. It is an institution, and in Mesopotamia, institutions tend to wear religious clothing. So when you see a ziggurat, do not only picture a mountain made of brick, picture a platform built for synchronization, a stable place above the flat land where the horizon is clear, a place where an observer can return night after night, season after season, a place where measurements can be repeated, a place where long records can be kept without changing the viewpoint. If you want reliable timekeeping, you need consistency. The same line of sight, the same reference points, the same method, the same teacher, the same archive. And once you build that, you can coordinate a city, because farmers can plant when the calendar says. Workers can show up when the temple schedule says. Festivals can happen when the sky says. Taxes can be due when the month ends, and kings can declare their rule aligned with cosmic order, so the sky becomes an administrative tool. Now the key detail is this. A lunar calendar drifts. 12 lunar months do not equal a solar year. So if you follow the moon alone, your spring festival slowly slides into summer. Your harvest rites slide into winter. Your schedule unravels. So you have to correct. You have to insert extra months. You have to decide when, and deciding when requires more than staring at the moon. It requires comparing the moon to the seasons. It requires tracking the sun indirectly through star risings. It requires institutional memory, because if one priest decides one year and another priest decides differently, the next year the calendar fractures. So the civilization needs a standardized rule set, or it needs a trusted authority that can declare adjustments. Either way, you are looking at a system that must be maintained carefully. Now notice how this interacts with the idea of early completeness. A culture can begin stargazing casually, but a culture does not begin intercalation casually. Intercalation is bureaucracy. It is a rule applied to reality. So if intercalation exists early, it suggests the culture has already crossed the boundary from noticing the sky to managing society by the sky. That boundary is not small. It requires a stable priesthood. It requires literacy, or at least stable record-keeping methods. It requires agreement across cities, or at minimum across institutions in one city. It requires a political structure that can enforce the calendar. So the existence of calendar control points to a deeper foundation. Now you might say the foundation could be built quickly, and it can. If an institution is strong enough, it can impose time standards quickly, but it still requires a base of observation and trust. because people will not accept calendar adjustments if they think the adjustments are arbitrary. The calendar has to match reality, so the authority has to demonstrate that it knows what it is doing. That means it must have records. It must have precedent. It must have patterns. It must have a tradition. Now slide into the world of omen texts. In Mesopotamia, celestial events are not neutral. They are messages. But even if you do not accept that framing the omen system reveals something practical, to interpret a sign, you need a baseline. You need to know what is normal. And normal is not obvious unless you track it. That means the omen tradition creates pressure for systematic observation. Because if you want to say this eclipse matters, you must know how often eclipses happen. If you want to say Venus is behaving strangely, you must know Venus's usual cycle. So divination becomes a reason to invest in data collection. A political reason, a religious reason, a social reason. And those reasons pay salaries. They justify the time of observers. They justify the storage of tablets. They justify the continuity of training. So the omen system is like a cultural engine that funds astronomy. Now here is the part that matters for the origin problem. If you have accurate predictions, you need long records. You can build a predictive model with a few years of data, but it will be rough. You can refine it with decades, but it will still be fragile. To reach serious reliability, you need many cycles. You need records spanning generations, which means a civilization that predicts well is a civilization that has been watching for a long time. So when you look at the quality of astronomical tables and you see precision, you are not only seeing intelligence, you are seeing continuity. And continuity is not guaranteed in the ancient world. Cities collapse, dynasties fall, war scatters people, floods destroy buildings. Yet the observations continue, so either the institutions are extraordinarily resilient or the knowledge travels, or both. Now think about how a long observation tradition can be preserved. One way is stable institutions, another way is copying. A record can be copied and moved. A teacher can carry a tablet to a new city. A tradition can jump from one library to another. So even if one city falls, another can maintain the series. That is why the scribal culture matters. It creates the mechanism that allows astronomical knowledge to survive disasters. But again, survival is not origin. It explains how knowledge remains. It does not explain how knowledge begins. Now focus on the structure of star cataloguing. A sky has infinite points. A catalogue selects. It says these stars matter. These constellations matter. These are the reference points. That selection is an act of design. Someone decided which stars to track. Someone decided how to group them. Someone decided how to name them. Someone decided how to map them into a working system. And mapping is not automatic. You can map in many ways. Different cultures see different patterns. So a standardized star system suggests a standardized viewpoint, a shared tradition, a shared set of categories. Now the moment a culture has categories that link stars to seasons, the sky becomes a calendar. And once the sky becomes a calendar, it becomes a tool for coordination. Now tie this to the way temples were aligned. If orientation is fixed in temple construction, then orientation is tied to cosmology. A temple is not only a building, it is a cosmic device. It is a place on earth that mirrors a structure in the sky. That is what the texts say in their own language. But even if you treat that as poetic, the practical implication remains. Orientation requires astronomy. Astronomy requires long observation. Long observation requires institutions. Institutions require authority. Authority requires story. So the architecture, the sky, the calendar, and the legitimacy narrative are not separate threads. They are a single braid. Now there is another clue hiding in the way these systems treat error. A casual stargazer can be wrong and shrug, but a calendar authority cannot shrug. If you declare the wrong month, the harvest schedule fails. If you schedule the wrong festival, you offend the gods, at least in cultural terms. If you predict the wrong eclipse, you lose credibility. So the system needs correction mechanisms. It needs a way to refine. It needs standards for accuracy. That implies something like a proto-scientific attitude. Not science as a modern institution, science as disciplined record-keeping and correction. And that is what makes the Mesopotamian sky tradition feel strangely modern. Because it is not only wonder, it is method. Now step away from the sky for a moment and ask what kind of society invests in method early. A society that has reason to fear discontinuity. A society that believes disaster can erase. A society that thinks knowledge must be held tightly. A society that prizes preservation. So once again you return to the same cultural posture. This is a civilization that behaves like a survivor. A survivor does not treat knowledge as casual. A survivor treats knowledge as something that can be lost. So the survivor builds redundant systems. Schools, archives, catalogues, series, calendars, and a worldview that says this knowledge is older than us. This knowledge is not ours to improve casually. This knowledge is what keeps us alive. Now notice how that worldview lines up with the flood boundary. Because if a culture believes a catastrophic break exists in history, it will naturally shape its institutions around continuity. It will build memory systems that resist breaks. It will train people to copy without deviation. It will treat ancient data as sacred. It will locate authority in the past. And it will frame knowledge as something received. Because in a world where the past includes disaster, the past becomes both warning and source. Now you might think that is still psychological. It does not prove anything about an earlier civilization, and it does not. But it does show that the culture's institutions are built as if they are maintaining something that must not be lost again. Now let's move into another domain where continuity is even harder to fake. Not the sky, not numbers, not buildings, bodies. Because when you treat bodies, you deal with pain, infection, injury, birth, death. You deal with outcomes that cannot be argued into existence. A treatment either helps or it does not. A patient either recovers or does not. So medical knowledge is a harsh test. It forces a culture to learn what works. And if a culture has a sophisticated medical tradition early, it suggests either long experimentation or inherited technique. And the medical texts carry a particular kind of tension. They combine practical recipes with ritual language. They mix method with meaning, which makes them a perfect window into the Mesopotamian mindset. Because in medicine, belief and technique live together, and the way they live together can tell you how knowledge is transmitted, not only as information, but as a complete practice. Walk into an ancient clinic in your mind, but do not imagine a modern room with bright lights. Imagine a corner of a temple complex, a small chamber, a table, a bowl, a bundle of dried plants, a jar of resin, a stone for grinding, a strip of cloth, a patient who has no idea what is happening inside his own body, only that it hurts, and a practitioner who has seen this pain before. That last part is everything, because medicine begins when someone recognizes repetition, when someone sees the same symptoms show up in different people, when someone notices that some people recover and some do not, when someone learns that certain plants reduce swelling, that certain resins keep a wound from turning foul, that a bandage needs to be changed, that a fracture must be held still. It is not magic to notice patterns, it is experience. But experience is fragile. Experience dies with the person unless it is transmitted. And Mesopotamia built transmission machines, tablets, schools, apprenticeships, So medical knowledge becomes something that can outlive a healer. It becomes something that can be carried forward. Now here is the striking point. When you look at early medical prescriptions, they are not vague. They are procedural. They tell you to grind, to mix, to heat, to filter, to apply. They name specific ingredients. They specify sequences. They assume that procedure matters. And once you assume procedure matters, you're already thinking like a technician, not a mystic. A technician can still be religious, of course. But the logic of technique is different. It is repeatable. It is teachable. It can be improved by refinement. Even if the culture frames the knowledge as divine, the knowledge itself operates through material cause. Now in Mesopotamia, a typical medical approach often lives in two tracks at once. Track one is the physical, an ointment, a poultice, a wash, a bandage, a splint, an incision. Track two is the spoken formula, an invocation, a recited line, a ritual action. Modern people often see track two and think that is superstition, throw it away. But if you are trying to understand knowledge transmission, do not throw it away. Because track two tells you how the culture trained healers to manage the human side of illness. Fear, pain, hopelessness, trust. A patient is not only a body, a patient is a mind. And if a patient believes the healer is powerless, compliance drops. If a patient believes the treatment is cursed, refusal rises. If a patient believes the gods are angry, panic spreads. So the healer must treat the narrative in the room. The spoken formula is a tool for controlling the atmosphere, for focusing attention, for establishing authority, for calming, for giving the patient a sense that the suffering has meaning and that help is present. This does not replace the ointment, it supports it. So the medical system is not primitive because it includes ritual. It is sophisticated because it integrates technique with psychology. Now here is where the origin question becomes sharp. A complex medical tradition usually shows evolution. You see crude remedies first, then refinement, then classification, then specialization, then professional regulation. But in Mesopotamia, you often see classification and regulation surprisingly early. You see organized diagnostic series. You see professional roles. You see different categories of practitioners. You see standards for what a trained person should know. And you see the knowledge being written down in ways that suggest it is already canonical. A canonical text is not a casual note. It is a statement. This is the right way. This is the recognized body of knowledge. And once a body of knowledge becomes canonical, it becomes conservative. People copy it. They preserve it. They teach it. They do not rewrite it easily. So when the earliest texts you encounter already have a canonical tone, it raises a question. How long did the tradition exist before it became canonical? Because canon is usually the result of time. Now there is another clue in the way the prescriptions combine ingredients. A beginner might try one plant at a time, but a mature tradition starts stacking. Resin plus oil plus mineral plus plant juice. Heat it, bind it, apply it, then cover it, then repeat. That kind of stacking suggests accumulated experience. It suggests that practitioners notice synergy, that combining certain substances produces a better effect, that some ingredients serve as carriers, that some serve as antiseptics, that some reduce pain. They did not use modern terms, but the behaviour is similar. You do not reach that complexity without either long local experimentation or imported technique. Now look at procedures like incision and drainage. This is not a soft practice. This is a willingness to cut. Cutting carries risk. Infection, bleeding, shock. A culture does not maintain cutting procedures unless the procedures sometimes work. If cutting consistently killed patients, the tradition would fade. So the existence of surgical instruction implies that practitioners had enough success to justify recording it, which implies a level of competence, which implies training. Now ask, how does training begin? The first surgeon has no teacher. The first surgeon is a risk taker. But once you have a tradition, it shifts. The surgeon becomes an inheritor. The apprentice learns from the master. And the master teaches not only what to do, but what not to do. Where to cut, how deep, how to clean, how to bandage, how to watch for fever. So the knowledge becomes a chain. Now a chain can stretch for centuries if the institutions protect it. But the chain also needs credibility, because medicine is judged by results. A community will stop trusting a healer who fails constantly. So a medical tradition that persists over generations is a tradition that delivers enough success to keep social trust. Even if the worldview includes gods and omens, the body still provides feedback. Now this is where Mesopotamia feels like a civilization obsessed with memory, because it does not rely on a single healer. It builds a training and text system, and texts change the nature of medicine. A healer without texts learns from his own cases. A healer with texts learns from many lifetimes of cases. He inherits a larger sample size, and that can accelerate sophistication dramatically. So you can have a situation where medical knowledge appears advanced early because writing turns experience into an archive, and an archive turns experience into an institution. Now you might say, okay, that explains speed, but it still assumes that the archive began locally, and the origin question remains, because the first archive still needs the first accumulated body of experience. And if the earliest archives we can see already look mature, then the earlier accumulation is hidden. Hidden either because the earlier stage used perishable media, or because it lived as oral instruction, or because it existed in a time and context not yet visible to us archaeologically. So once again, you hit the same wall. The record shows us a functioning system. The record does not show us the first steps. Now add one more dimension: professional accountability. Some legal texts in Mesopotamia imply standards for medical practice and consequences for failure. This matters because regulation implies a recognized profession. A recognized profession implies a recognized body of knowledge, and recognized knowledge implies established teaching. So regulation is not the beginning. It is the sign that a tradition has matured enough to be socially important. Now imagine being a student in a scribal school and being assigned a medical text. You are not writing your own remedies. You are copying established series. You are learning vocabulary. You are memorizing symptoms. You are training your hand to preserve the exact words. And that tells you something about the culture. It does not just want healers. It wants standardized healers, because standardized healers produce predictable outcomes. And predictability is what institutions crave. It reduces chaos. It reduces lawsuits in modern terms. It reduces unrest. It preserves labour capacity. It preserves the workforce. A temple economy depends on bodies. Bodies that can work. Bodies that can farm. Bodies that can fight. So medicine is not only compassion, it is infrastructure. Now link this back to the larger theme. In Mesopotamia, knowledge is rarely treated as personal property. It is treated as institutional property. It belongs to the temple, to the school, to the archive, to the tradition. And that is why the culture keeps saying the same thing in different ways. Knowledge is received. Knowledge is preserved. Knowledge is transmitted. The healer receives techniques not only from a teacher, but from a lineage. And the lineage is protected by texts. Now there is one more twist. The presence of divine language in medical texts can function as a seal. A spiritual seal. If you recite the formula, you are not just applying a remedy, You are participating in the authorized tradition. You are doing medicine the correct way. So ritual becomes a marker of legitimacy. It tells the patient this healer is not a random person with herbs. This healer is connected to the temple, connected to the gods, connected to the tradition. And legitimacy is what allows the healer to operate. Now, the question that naturally follows is not only where did the medical knowledge originate, but how did a civilization build a system that could preserve multiple domains of knowledge at once? Because medicine is one domain, astronomy is another, mathematics is another, law is another, architecture is another. What binds them is not a single inventor. What binds them is the scribal machine, the educational machine, the curriculum, the training pipeline. So the next movement is into the tablet house, not as a school in the modern sense, as a factory for continuity. Picture a building that exists for one reason, to keep the civilization from forgetting itself. Not a palace, not a temple, a school, a tablet house. A place where clay is cheap but attention is expensive, because clay can be dug up from the river banks, but a trained mind takes years. And Mesopotamia decided that trained minds were worth the investment, so the student arrives early. Not because learning is romantic, because learning is discipline. The teacher is strict, not because the teacher is cruel, because accuracy is survival. A sign copied wrong can change meaning. A number copied wrong can ruin an account. A measurement copied wrong can collapse a wall. A date copied wrong can disrupt a festival cycle. A legal clause copied wrong can spark a dispute. So the curriculum begins with the smallest unit. The sign, a wedge. A vertical, a horizontal. A set of strokes pressed into wet clay. The student repeats. Again and again, the hand learns before the mind fully understands. This is how scribal culture works. It is physical memory, muscle memory. A trained hand produces legible knowledge. Now, as the student improves, the assignment changes. He moves from signs to lists. And the lists are not just language drills. They are an attempt to inventory reality. Trees, stones, animals, tools, professions, gods. In a modern classroom, a list looks boring. In an ancient city, a list is power, because a list is classification, and classification is control. If you can name a thing, you can account for it. If you can account for it, you can manage it. If you can manage it, you can tax it, trade it, allocate it. So the lexical lists are not only vocabulary, they are a worldview. They teach a student how to organize the world into categories that the administrative system can use. And this matters because it shows something deeper than literacy. It shows a civilization that believes knowledge should be systematized, not only remembered, structured. Now the student continues. He copies model texts. He copies contracts. He copies receipts. He copies hymns. He copies proverbs. He copies stories. But again, the goal is not creative writing. The goal is fidelity. The student is being trained as a conduit, not as an author. And that tells you something about cultural priorities. A culture obsessed with invention trains authors. A culture obsessed with preservation trains copyists. Mesopotamia trains copyists. Now you might think copying is dull, but copying is how a civilization becomes durable. Because a copied text can cross time. A spoken lesson fades. A memory dies. A tablet can survive fire. A tablet can survive burial. A tablet can survive abandonment. So the scribal school is a technology for defeating chaos. Now look at the way this system treats language. Sumerian eventually becomes a scholarly language, no longer spoken in daily life, yet students still learn it. This is not an accident. This is because the old texts are in Sumerian, and the old texts carry authority. So the scribes become bilingual in a way that serves tradition. They maintain a dead language because they believe the knowledge embedded in that language must not be lost. This is not only conservative, it is sophisticated. It implies an awareness that translation is imperfect, that meaning lives in nuance, that the original forms matter. So scribal culture becomes a form of early scholarship, not only writing, philology, a respect for the precise shape of words and signs. Now shift into mathematics in the school context. A student copies tables, multiplication, reciprocals, squares, cubes, not because the student is discovering these relationships, because the student is being handed a toolkit. And that is the key feeling again, toolkit. Mesopotamian education is tool-driven, practical. You learn methods that already exist. You practice them until you can apply them under pressure. Because a scribe is not working in a quiet library. A scribe is working in administration, where mistakes cost real resources. Now the tablets from schools often show errors, scratched corrections, clumsy signs, numbers that do not align properly, and that is good, because it reveals something human, students struggling, teachers intervening, learning happening in real time. So the system is not mythical, it is real, it is sweaty, it is routine. And it is built to produce a certain kind of person, a person who can keep records, a person who can calculate, a person who can draft a contract, a person who can copy an ancient text without drifting, a person who can preserve the continuity of a civilization. Now here is the part that connects directly to the origin puzzle. If your curriculum is mostly copying, what does that do to the culture's relationship with the past? It makes the past feel present. It makes ancient material part of everyday training. It makes authority flow backward, not forward. So the civilization's default posture becomes, the old is reliable, the old is proven, the old is authoritative, newness is suspicious, innovation is risky. And in systems where risk can destroy stability, that mindset makes sense. Now this is the same mindset you see in the rebuilding of temples. Rebuild on the same foundation, keep the same axis, maintain the same proportions, do not deviate, because deviation is disrespectful to the sacred plan. But even if you strip away sacred framing, the behavior remains. Maintain standards. Maintain templates, maintain continuity. Now think about what that does to knowledge. A conservative educational system is not designed to produce new discoveries. It is designed to maintain a complex machine. And a complex machine can run for a long time if the training pipeline is stable. So Mesopotamian civilization achieves longevity not through constant innovation, but through constant replication. That is why the same types of texts appear again and again across centuries. The same lists, the same problem sets, the same hymns, the same proverbs, the same canonical compositions. This is not stagnation, this is durability. Now the presence of canonical texts in the curriculum raises another question. Where did the canonical texts come from? A canon does not appear at the first moment of writing. A canon is selected. It is refined. It is agreed upon. So even if writing emerges quickly, canon formation usually takes time. Or it suggests that certain texts already existed in some form and were then fixed into a canonical shape when writing became the dominant medium. So again, you see the same pattern. The earliest visible record is already curated, already structured, already standardized, meaning the earlier stage is hidden behind the first surviving layers, hidden behind the fact that most early materials did not survive, hidden behind the possibility that oral tradition carried structure long before clay recorded it. Now consider the political implications of scribal standardization. If scribal training is similar across multiple cities, then knowledge transcends city boundaries. Scribes become a shared class. They speak the same technical language. They use the same measurement units. They use the same calendar terms. They know the same legal forms. This creates cultural unity even when politics are fragmented. So, scribal culture is also a glue. It is a way for a region to share civilization even when it does not share a king. Now, that shared system can also carry ancient claims. Claims about kingship descending. Claims about sages teaching. Claims about the flood dividing time. Because when students copy those claims as part of education, the claims become embedded, not as entertainment, as foundation. So the mythic and the administrative merge. Not because the scribes were confused, because the civilization's self-understanding is built into the knowledge pipeline. The origin narrative is part of the curriculum. And when an origin narrative becomes part of the curriculum, it becomes stable. It can survive centuries. Now ask yourself, what kind of culture would embed an origin narrative into training? A culture that needs legitimacy. A culture that needs continuity. A culture that believes its knowledge is a trust. A culture that thinks its civilization is a restoration. Because if you think what you have can be lost, you train the next generation to value it and preserve it. Now, the next movement in the investigation is to step outside the school and look at the world that came before the first urban explosion, not as an empty prehistory, as a long stretch of villages, pottery, irrigation, and slowly growing complexity. Because if the school is the transmission machine, the question becomes, what was it transmitting into? What kind of world was ready to receive the full package of city life? And why does the shift into that package feel so sudden? Now imagine you are standing in a village that has no writing, no sealed tablets, no receipts, no official archives. Still, it is not simple. It has irrigation ditches. It has storage. It has planned space. It has people who know seasons, soil, water, and risk. This is the world archaeologists call the Ubaid period, not a blank space. A long, steady stretch of life where communities learn how to live on a river plain that can feed you and ruin you. The pottery from this time is one of the first things that makes you pause, because it is not sloppy, it is controlled. Shapes repeated with consistency, patterns repeated with intention. Even when you know the wheel is not yet dominant, you still see standard forms travelling across distance. And standard forms mean shared tradition. Shared tradition means communication. So these villages are not isolated, they are connected. Now look at the buildings. Early houses are small, later houses grow. Some sites show structures that feel communal or ritual. Not because we can read signs on the walls, but because the floor plans start to suggest a role beyond family living. A larger room, a central space, a layout that implies gathering. So authority begins to emerge. Not necessarily kingship, but coordination. Someone organises labour. Someone decides where canals go. Someone decides where grain is stored. Someone mediates disputes. These are the first bones of administration even without documents. Now in this village world, life moves at a human pace. Seasons, planting, harvest, repair, children, marriage, death. A cycle repeated with slight changes. And over centuries the settlements slowly grow. Villages become larger villages. Larger villages become towns. The social web thickens. More people, more specialisation. Someone makes pots full time. Someone makes tools. Someone organises irrigation. Someone leads rituals. Nothing here feels like a sudden leap. It feels like what humans do everywhere when they settle and farm. Now here is the part that creates tension. At some point this steady pace changes. And in the archaeological record, the pace change looks abrupt. Not in the sense that villages vanish. Many sites show continuity, but in the sense that complexity spikes. A town becomes a true city. Temples become monumental. Accounting becomes systematic. Trade becomes long distance. The scale of organisation jumps. And this jump is what people struggle to explain, because most complex systems take time to develop in visible steps. But here, the steps feel compressed. Now, one common explanation is that we are simply missing the steps. That earlier experiments existed, but we have not found them. Or they were made from materials that decayed. Wood tablets, leather, reeds. Or the early texts were written on perishable media and clay took over later. This is possible. But it asks you to imagine a quiet revolution that left almost no trace. A hidden curriculum. A hidden archive. A hidden phase of experimentation. It could exist. But the evidence is thin, so the gap still feels real. Now there is another explanation people reach for. That knowledge or organisational methods came from elsewhere, through trade, through migration, through contact with regions we do not fully understand. This also could happen, but then you need a donor. You need a place where the systems were already more developed, a place that taught or influenced the river plain. And finding that donor in early dates is difficult, because the early record in many neighbouring regions does not show clear earlier writing or comparable administrative scale. So the donor becomes hypothetical, and a hypothetical donor does not fully satisfy. Now there is a third explanation, that the leap is local but driven by new pressures. Population increases, irrigation expands, surplus grows, competition intensifies, temples become organising centres, leaders emerge, and once the social machine reaches a tipping point, it reorganises, like water turning to steam. Same substance, new phase. This is actually a strong explanation. Tipping points are real. Systems can appear to jump even when underlying causes are gradual. But even tipping points usually leave transitional clutter, crude early writing, messy accounting, competing sign styles, unstable measurement units, a period where different towns try different standards. But in the Mesopotamian case, certain standards look surprisingly consistent once they appear. And that consistency raises another question. Who coordinated it? How did multiple cities agree? Why do measurement units look unified? Why does the numerical system look stable? Why does the writing system become functional quickly? Why does the administration look like it knows what it is doing? Now step away from the explanations and look at the human experience of the shift. Imagine being a farmer's child in a Ubaid town. You know canals, you know seasons, you know pottery, you know a local shrine. Then in your lifetime the town grows. More strangers arrive, more goods appear, copper tools, stone from far places, new seals that mark ownership, new rooms that store communal grain, new officials who count and record. And then one day you see clay tokens turned into marks. You watch someone press a sign into wet clay. And suddenly, a transaction becomes permanent, not as memory, as document. Now, this moment changes everything, because the instant you can record, you can expand, you can tax, you can organise labour at scale, you can plan major construction, you can enforce contracts, you can create bureaucracy, you can create a city. So writing is not only communication, it is infrastructure. It allows complexity to stay stable. Now the striking thing is that when this infrastructure arrives, it seems to arrive as a package. Writing, seals, standard weights, temple administration, specialised labour, long-distance trade. These systems reinforce each other. Writing makes accounting possible. Accounting makes large temples manageable. Large temples organise labour. Organised labour builds canals and monuments. Canals increase surplus. Surplus supports specialists. Specialists produce goods and knowledge. Knowledge improves organisation, so the package grows stronger with each loop. And if the package appears quickly, it is because loops accelerate. So the Uruk world can expand fast. Now here is the puzzle. Acceleration explains speed. It explains growth. But it does not fully explain maturity, because a loop can accelerate something crude into something larger. But maturity implies refinement, and refinement usually comes from prior cycles. So you still face the question, where did the refined methods come from at the moment the loop began? Now this is where the Mesopotamian narrative becomes interesting, even if you do not accept it literally. Because the Mesopotamian story does not frame the leap as invention, it frames it as activation, a switch being turned on, a system being reintroduced, a structure being restored. And if you imagine the Ubaid world as a recovery phase, not a development phase, then the pattern looks different. Villages are not early steps towards civilization. Villages are people rebuilding after a break, maintaining what they can, keeping a sacred site active, holding on to tradition, waiting for conditions, population, surplus, stability. Then when conditions are right, the old blueprint can be used again. Administration, writing, mathematics, temple hierarchy, urban planning. Because if those templates exist in memory, in tradition, in teaching, then the leap becomes less mysterious. It becomes a deployment, not a creation. Now you do not have to believe in any supernatural version of that to understand the concept. Knowledge can be preserved. Skills can be carried by specialists. Ritual systems can maintain a framework. A small group can hold an institutional memory that a wider population does not actively use until the moment arrives. And this happens even today. A country can lose a technology and later revive it from manuals. A community can keep techniques alive in guilds. A religion can preserve a calendar system across political change. So the idea is not impossible. The question is evidence. Can we see traces of that kind of preservation? Do we see continuity in sacred sites? Yes. Do we see consistent temple rebuilding on the same axis? Yes. Do we see early systems looking surprisingly ready? Yes. So the pattern fits, but fitting is not proving. Now move to a different angle. Look at the flood motif, not as a single event, but as a way cultures mark a break. A break is not always global. A break can be regional. A break can destroy cities. A break can scatter populations. A break can wipe out archives. A break can break transmission. If a major flood hit multiple settlements, the knowledge pipeline could fracture. And after a fracture, you can have a long rebuilding period where life continues but complexity stays low. Because complexity requires stable institutions. Stable institutions require stability. So the Ubaid world could be stable enough for villages, but not stable enough for large-scale urban administration. Then later stability returns and the package becomes possible again. Now look at the emotional logic of the Mesopotamian claim. When people live through catastrophe, they do not say we advanced gradually. They say we survived, we restored, we rebuilt, we remembered. So the language of restoration is what you would expect from a culture that feels it inherited a broken world. And even if the details are mythic, the emotional core can still reflect a real experience. Now the next movement in the investigation is to focus on the teacher figures. Not because we can verify them as literal beings, but because teacher figures are the culture's way of describing transmission, and if the culture keeps saying we were taught, then the key question becomes, what form could teaching have taken in a world crossing breaks, catastrophes and gaps? Who were the teachers in human terms? And what did it mean to say knowledge descended?